Hello guys, how are you all? Welcome back to my channel. So, today we are gonna see, what if Naruto got female Kurama pregnant after learn her Mestry? And subscribe if you enjoy the video. And also check the description. So let's begin the story. Naruto Uzumaki sat cross-legged on the rooftop of his apartment. The same apartment he had lived in since before he was old enough to understand why the village looked at him the way it did. The wooden boards beneath him were worn smooth from years of use, scuffed by his knees and boots, and the restless pacing of a boy who could never sit still. He was not that boy anymore. He was 20 years old, and he had learned, slowly and painfully, the art of stillness. He breathed in. He breathed out. Below him, Konoha hummed with its quiet evening life. Lanterns swayed in the wind along the main street. A dog barked somewhere near the Inuzuka district. He could hear laughter drifting from Ichiraku Ramen. Tochiji's voice, cheerful and loud as ever, carrying even from this distance. The village that had once felt like a cage around him now felt like a heartbeat. Familiar. Warm. His. 2 years had passed since the Fourth Shinobi War. 2 years since Madara had fallen. Since Obito had made his final choice. Since Naruto had stood on a battlefield surrounded by the dead and the grieving and had told himself, over and over, that this was the last time. That he would build something that made all of it worth it. He was trying. He really was. But tonight, something was wrong. He'd felt it since morning. A low, thrumming unease in his chest that had nothing to do with anxiety or bad ramen. It was deeper than that. Older. It vibrated in the place just below his ribs where Kurama's chakra always simmered, that familiar warmth like a banked fire, always present, always steady. But tonight it wasn't steady. Tonight it pulsed in an irregular rhythm, like a drumbeat skipping every fourth count. Hey, he thought inward. You doing okay in there? Silence. That, more than anything, put him on edge. Kurama was never fully silent. Even when she wasn't in the mood to talk, which was often, there was always the sense of her presence, that massive, ancient weight at the back of his awareness, like knowing a mountain existed even when your eyes were closed. She was always there. Tonight, that presence felt strange. Shifted. Like the mountain had moved 3 inches to the left, and he couldn't explain how he knew, only that he did. Kurama. He pushed his chakra inward deliberately this time, letting his consciousness sink down through the layers of his awareness, through the physical, through the surface, into the place that the Uzumaki clan sealing texts called the nation, the inner heart, though Naruto had always just called it his mindscape. Most Jinchuriki, from what he'd read in the clan scrolls Tsunade had unlocked for him after the war, experienced their mindscape as a prison. Chains and darkness, and the smell of damp stone. His had changed. It had started changing the night he and Kurama had come to their first real understanding. The night he had looked the fox in the eye and said, "I'm not going to run from you anymore." Since then, the great sewer-like pipes and the ankle-deep water had slowly, gradually, over months and years, transformed into something else. The water had receded. The stone had warmed. Trees had begun to grow, strange, luminous trees with silver bark and leaves that were faintly orange, like fox fur caught in autumn light. He didn't know if it was his doing or Kurama's or some combination of the two, and he had stopped trying to figure it out. Tonight, as he sank into the mindscape, the trees were not silver. They were red. Not orange, red. A deep, arterial crimson, like something burned at their core. The light was wrong too, thicker than usual, pressing against him as he walked the familiar paths. The air smelled different, less like pine and wind and more like something ancient and electrical, like the moment before lightning struck. Kurama? His voice echoed strangely. In the mindscape, his own voice always sounded more like it had in childhood, a little less certain, a little less polished, as if this space remembered who he'd been before he'd learned to be confident. He walked through the redlit trees and felt, for the first time in a long time, genuinely uncertain. The great seal door was ahead. It was not the original gate. That one had been dismantled years ago by gradual, mutual agreement, its massive bolts and bars dissolving one by one every time Naruto and Kurama reached a new level of understanding. What remained was more like a threshold. 2 tall stone pillars with a single horizontal bar between them, strung with ofuda, ceremonial paper talismans in the Uzumaki style, dense with his mother's script. It was elegant and old, and it had always felt, to him, less like a prison door and more like a doorframe between two rooms in the same house. Tonight, 3 of the Ofuda were on fire. He stopped. The paper burned without consuming itself, a steady supernatural flame, and the light from it was the same deep red as the trees. The air around the threshold hummed at a frequency he felt in his back teeth. Beyond the pillars, he could see the space where Kurama usually resided, normally a great open plain of silver grass, vast enough that he couldn't see the edges. But now it was obscured by a fog so thick it swallowed the light. "Okay," he said out loud, mostly to steady himself. "Okay. I'm coming in." He stepped through the threshold. The fog closed around him immediately, warm and dense, pressing against his skin. He couldn't see more than 5 feet in any direction. He reached for Kurama's chakra instinctively, the way he'd learned to, like reaching for a hand in the dark, and felt it immediately, huge and overwhelming, pulling him forward like a tide. He followed it. He walked for what felt like several minutes through the fog, his sandals soundless on ground he could feel but couldn't see, until the fog thinned and he stepped out into a clearing he had never seen before. It was not the silver plain. It was a space that felt much older. The ground was dark stone, smooth and ancient, carved with patterns he didn't recognize, spirals within spirals, intersecting in ways that made his eyes slide sideways if he looked too directly. At the center of the clearing was a tree that dwarfed every other tree in the mindscape, its roots plunging into the stone like it had grown there before the world had fully decided what stone was for. Its trunk was the deep red of the other trees amplified tenfold. Its branches spread overhead in a canopy so wide the sky was hidden, and beneath it, at the base of the trunk, curled in a posture Naruto had never seen Kurama adopt, she looked different. That was his first thought, and it arrived in his mind with all the subtlety of a thrown brick. He had been inside the mindscape hundreds of times by now. He knew Kurama's form the way you knew the shape of something you'd been looking at your whole life. The 9 tails. The massive, crushing scale of her. The way the space always seemed slightly too small for her even when it wasn't. But the fox before him was not filling the space. She was curled at the base of the tree with her tails wrapped around herself, all 9 of them, tucked close, and she was perhaps half the size she normally appeared. Not diminished. Something else, concentrated, as if her mass had not lessened but merely gathered inward, folded into a tighter arrangement. And as he stepped closer and the light fell differently across her, he noticed other things. Her fur was still red gold, but it shimmered differently in the strange crimson light of this space. More like flame, more like motion, more like something that was always changing and never still. Her face, turned away from him, had a shape he couldn't quite parse from this angle. The chakra radiating from her was the same chakra he'd always known, that vast, overwhelming, ancient power, but there was a note in it he'd never detected before. Something that resonated at a frequency just outside his normal range. Something he'd perhaps always missed. "Kurama," he said. Her head turned. Naruto had spent years looking Kurama in the eye. He'd done it the first time when he was 16 and half drowning in grief on a battlefield. And he told himself then that he wasn't afraid of her. He believed it, too. He looked at those enormous red eyes with their slitted pupils and he'd felt something that wasn't fear, something more complicated and more real. But he had always been looking up at her. The eyes that looked at him now were level with his own, because the fox was looking at him not from far above but from a face that was. He stopped walking. He didn't stop because he was afraid. He stopped because his brain, which was usually very good at processing rapidly changing situations and battle conditions, was currently running into a wall. The face was humanoid. Not entirely. Not in the way that would make her look human. The ears were fox ears, large and tipped with white, rising from dark hair that fell in loose waves around a face that was angular and sharp and carried the weight of something that had been alive for longer than most countries. Her eyes were still those unmistakable eyes, deep crimson, slitted ancient, but set in features that were. She was watching him process this with an expression that, despite everything, he would have described as exasperated. "Close your mouth," she said. "You look like you're trying to catch rain." Her voice was always the same. He'd heard it inside his head and across the threshold of the seal for years. Low, authoritative, with that particular flatness that came from having been alive long enough that most things stopped being surprising. The voice at least he recognized completely. He stopped. Tried again. "What?" I know. She turned her face away. Sit down, Naruto. Before you fall down. He sat down. Possibly because his legs made the decision without consulting the rest of him. He was sitting cross-legged on ancient stone in a space inside his own mind, looking at Kurama. His Kurama, the nine-tailed fox, the demon that had leveled a village on the night of his birth, who was sitting at the base of a tree he'd never seen before in a form she'd never shown him, wrapped in all 9 of her tails like she was cold. Start talking, he said. He was proud of how level his voice was. I was wondering when you'd notice. She didn't look at him. Her 9 tails shifted, slow and agitated, the tips moving independently like a cat's. I felt it change 6 months ago. The first time. I didn't tell you. Why not? Because I didn't understand it. The words came out clipped and precise in the way they did when she was working hard to sound certain. He'd learned that cadence over years of listening to her. Because I have existed for longer than your civilization, and I did not know what was happening inside my own seal, and I found that uncomfortable. Uncomfortable, he repeated. Don't push it. He looked around the clearing. The red-lit trees at its edges. The spiraling patterns in the stone. What is this place? I've never seen this part of the mindscape. You weren't meant to. She paused. It has always been here. Below the rest. I kept it closed. It is private. Another pause, longer this time. It is where I actually reside. The silver plane is a construction. Something I made to have space between us. Her tails shifted again. I don't know why I brought you here tonight. The seal did it. Something in the seal has been changing. The Ofuda are burning outside. I know. 3 of them. I know. Should I be worried? She finally turned to look at him again. He held the eye contact, something he trained himself to do, and this close, with her face at this scale. The detail of those eyes was something he'd never fully had access to before. They were not simply red. They were layered, depth behind depth behind depth, like looking through red water towards something that had been sinking for 10,000 years. The seal is not failing, she said. It is evolving. What your mother built was extraordinary. The Uzumaki art at its finest. But she built it to contain something that was, at the time, purely hostile. A pause. We are not, at this time, purely hostile to one another. No, he agreed. We're not. Something moved across her expression that he didn't have a name for. When the nature of the relationship changes fundamentally, the seal responds. It has happened before in history, though rarely. When a Jinchuriki and their Bijou reach a state of genuine alliance rather than coercion, she stopped. The texts call it Kyushin. Resonant hearts. I've heard that term. He leaned forward slightly. In the Uzumaki clan archives. Tsunade let me read them. There was a passage about the fox's mastery. Her voice was very flat now. Yes. I know which passage. You can read the archives? I can see everything you've seen. I've always been able to. She said it without apology. Including what you've read about me. He absorbed this. In the years he'd spent building their partnership, there had been moments of revelation. Moments when he'd realized just how much access they had to one another in ways he hadn't fully understood. He'd stopped being unsettled by most of them. This one landed a little differently, but he filed it away. The fox's mastery, he said. The Uzumaki text said it was a technique. An ancient fusion of Jinchuriki chakra and Bijou essence. They said it had only been attempted twice in recorded history and that neither attempt was fully documented. That's what the texts say. She looked at him steadily. What they don't say is why. Tell me. For a long moment, she was still. Then she uncurled one of her tails, slowly, deliberately, and laid it on the stone between them. It was an enormous tail, easily 4 times his height if stretched to its full length, and the fur was the richest red gold he'd ever seen, shimmering even in this strange light. It was the first time she had ever extended any part of herself toward him in the mindscape, and he understood instinctively that it meant something he didn't have language for yet. I have been alive, she said slowly, for longer than you can truly conceptualize. I do not say that to dismiss you. I say it because it is a relevant fact. I have existed since before the Sage of 6 Paths bound us. Before the Bijou were separate beings. I remember, Not clearly, the way you remember things, but in the way an ocean remembers rain, what it was to be whole. He listened. He was very good at listening now. It had taken years. When I was placed inside you, she continued, I was angry. I had been used. By Madara's technique, then by the Kyuubi mask of the man who would become the fourth Hokage's enemy, then by the seal itself, which I experienced at the time as the cruelest thing that had ever been done to me, which is a significant distinction. Her voice had dropped to something just above a murmur. I wanted nothing from you. I wanted you to die young and free me. I believed that was the only outcome I would accept. I know, he said quietly. I was wrong. She said it with the decisiveness of someone who had practiced saying it, and had not yet found it easy. I did not expect, I could not have predicted, that you would be the way you are. That your obstinacy would eventually become something I found I did not want directed anywhere else. A pause. I did not expect to find you interesting. And then significant. And then, she stopped. The clearing was very quiet. The red light pulsed once steady, and then something I did not have a word for, she finished. Which is an unusual experience for something as old as I am. Naruto looked at the tail lying between them on the stone, and he reached out, slowly, the way you moved around something you didn't want to startle, and placed his hand on it. The chakra surge was immediate and enormous, and it would have knocked him off his feet if he hadn't been sitting. It roared through him like a river breaking a dam, warm, overwhelming, ancient, and for a moment he couldn't see anything except light. Then it steadied, pulled back to something that was still vast but that he could exist inside without losing himself. Like standing at the edge of a great fire and feeling its heat without being burned. Kurama had gone very still. The fox's mastery, she said, very quietly. The reason it was only attempted twice and neither attempt was documented, the reason it was considered mythological rather than practical, is that it requires a level of mutual trust that no Jinchuriki and Bijou in recorded history had actually achieved before they tried. She paused. Because the technique does not work through coercion. It does not work through dominance, or containment, or even respect. It works through something else. What? He asked. She looked at him. Do you know, she said, how long it has been since anyone looked at me the way you do? He didn't answer. He wasn't sure there was an answer that wouldn't either say too much, or too little. The fox's mastery, she continued, is what happens when a Jinchuriki's soul and a Bijou's essence have become truly resonant. Not merge, not what the sage's sons attempted. Resonant, like two strings on an instrument tuned to the same note. When it happens genuinely, the Bijou's deepest power becomes accessible, not borrowed, not forced, but shared. She looked at the burning Ofuda beyond the tree line. The seal is recognizing what we have already become. The burning is not destruction. It is transformation. And the form you're in right now? He asked. She was quiet for a moment. Then, I have always been this. The immense fox that fills the seal, that is also real. But it is not my only form. It is the form of containment, of the self as it exists under threat. Her tails shifted slowly. This is older. More fundamental. When there is no threat, when the space between us has become something I am not afraid of, she stopped. I have not been in this form in a very long time. Naruto sat with that for a while. The red light pulsed above them, steady and warm, and somewhere in the trees, if you listened very carefully, at the edge of hearing, there was something that might have been wind, or might have been breathing, or might have been the sound of a seal beginning to change into something its maker had never anticipated, and might not have had words for if she had. Okay, he said finally. Kurama looked at him. I need to understand the fox's mastery, he said. Everything about it. If the seal is already changing, if we're already on this path whether we chose it consciously or not, then I need to understand what I'm walking into. He met her eyes steadily. And I need you to tell me, all of it. Not what the texts say. What you know. For a very long time, she was still. Then she did something he had never seen her do before. It was a small thing, almost nothing. A slight relenting in the set of her jaw. A fraction of the ancient weight behind her eyes going somewhere softer, somewhere less armored. You understand, she said carefully, that if I teach you this, there is no going back to what we were before. Yeah, he said. I know. The transformation is irreversible. The seal will become something entirely different from what your mother built. Something neither of us can fully predict. Yeah, the power it will give you is not something Konoha will understand. The village will have questions you may not be able to answer. Kurama. He looked at her directly. When has that ever stopped either of us? And in the deep red light of a clearing in the center of his soul, with his hand resting on a tail that radiated enough power to level a mountain, and with 3 ancient seals burning at the threshold behind them, in that moment, the nine-tailed fox, who had been alive longer than civilization and had trusted no one and nothing for most of that time, did something she had not done in 10,000 years. She laughed. It was short. Surprised. The sound of something that had not expected to find amusement, and had found it anyway. But it was real, and it moved through the clearing like a warm wind, and the trees that had been burning red shifted, just for a moment, to something closer to gold. Then I will teach you, she said. He grinned at her. The grin that had driven every enemy he'd ever had slightly insane, the grin that had once been pure stubborn bravado and had grown, over years, into something more complicated and more earned. So, he said. Where do we start? The clearing hummed around them. The seal burned its quiet transformation at the edges of the mindscape. Inside the apartment in Konoha, Naruto's body sat unmoving on the rooftop while the lanterns below swayed in the north wind and the village went about its warm, living business all around him. And deep in the place where a human soul and an ancient bija had slowly, impossibly, against all probability and expectation, built something that neither of them had a complete word for yet, they began. The morning after a person's soul begins to change, the world looks exactly the same. That was the first thing Naruto noticed when he opened his eyes on the rooftop. The sky was the same pale pre-dawn gray it always was at this hour. The lanterns below had burned down to their last half-inch of oil, and Tsuchiji's was already producing the distant, warm smell of broth starting on an early fire. A cat was sitting on the adjacent rooftop looking at him with the particular contempt that cats reserved for humans who spent their nights sitting outside in the cold doing things that cats found incomprehensible. Everything was the same. He was not. He knew it the way you knew when a room's temperature had shifted by 2 degrees, not dramatically, not in any way he could have pointed to and said there, that is the thing that changed. But the knowledge was absolute and physical and settled somewhere in his chest alongside the warmth of Kurama's chakra. That warmth felt different this morning, not hotter, not stronger in the traditional sense, but more present, more layered. Like a sound he'd always been hearing with one ear and was now hearing with 2. He rolled his neck, stood, stretched until his spine produced several protests. Then he stood at the edge of the rooftop with his hands in his pockets, and looked at Konoha waking up below him, and he thought, I need to go to the library. The Konoha Shinobi archives were housed in a 3-story building behind the Hokage Tower, not the public library with its general collection of history and theory, and the dog-eared copies of Jiraiya's novels, that appeared and disappeared from the shelves with suspicious regularity. The archives were the real collection, floor-to-ceiling shelves of mission records, sealed technique scrolls, classified historical documentation, and the materials that various clans had contributed to the village's collective repository over the decades. The Uzumaki materials occupied the entirety of the 3rd floor's eastern wing, and they had been largely inaccessible to anyone for the better part of 40 years because the Uzumaki clan was, for most of that period, not a living presence in the village but a memory, and a painful one. After the war, Tsunade had made it one of her priorities to catalog and restore the collection. She had given Naruto unrestricted access 2 years ago with the gruff, almost embarrassed caveat that your clan built half of what this village is founded on, and you should know it. He had been reading his way through the collection in the hours between training and sleep, slowly and often with a dictionary because his ancestors had written in an archaic script that the modern Konoha curriculum did not cover. He'd gotten good at the language. He was not yet fluent, but he was functional. The archivist on duty at the front desk was Ogata-san, a retired chunin in her 60s with reading glasses she refused to acknowledge needing and an expression of perpetual mild suspicion toward anyone who entered before business hours. She looked up when Naruto pushed through the door at 6:45 in the morning, took in his expression, and sighed in the specific way that said not you again. 3rd floor? She said. 3rd floor, he confirmed. specifically the sealed subsection. I need the Uzumaki theoretical texts. The ones that aren't in the main catalog. She gave him a long look over her glasses. Those require written authorization from the Hokage. I have standing authorization. Tsunade-bachan signed off on it 2 years ago. Tsunade-sama is not currently Hokage. Kakashi-sensei is Hokage. And he gave me blanket access to the Uzumaki collection specifically in writing last spring because I asked. He pulled a folded document from his jacket. He'd had the foresight to bring it, which was growth, honestly, and set it on the desk. I know because I had to argue with him for 3 hours to get it, and I still remember everything I said. Ogata-san examined the document with the thoroughness of someone who had once found a forged pass and had never quite recovered from how personally she'd taken it. Then she handed it back and jerked her head toward the stairs. Don't crease the old paper, she said. I find one crease and I'm confiscating your standing authorization. Yes, ma'am, he said, and meant it. The third-floor eastern wing was quiet at this hour. No other researchers. The morning light coming in low and amber through the narrow windows and falling across shelves of scrolls and bound texts in a way that made the whole space look like something out of one of the old illustrations in the history books he'd been given in the academy. He always half expected to find someone from a previous century still sitting at one of the reading tables, bent over a scroll, unaware that the era they'd lived in had ended. He went straight to the subsection he wanted, a locked alcove behind the main shelves. Its entrance marked with an Uzumaki seal of preservation that kept the air inside slightly cooler and drier than the surrounding room. He'd gotten a key to this alcove in the same negotiation with Kakashi that had produced his blanket access, and it took him 3 tries to get it open because the lock was old and temperamental. Inside were approximately 40 texts. Some were scrolls, most were bound volumes in the old Uzumaki style, covers of cured leather. Pages of a thin but remarkably durable paper that had survived decades without degrading. The majority of these he had already read at least partially. A handful he had set aside because their language was advanced enough that he needed to build up to them, planning to return when his reading had improved. He went to that handful now. The one he was looking for was the third from the left on the bottom shelf, a narrow volume, less than 100 pages, with no title on the spine. On the cover, embossed in the red and white spiral that was the Uzumaki clan symbol, Kyushin no Fumi. Letters on resonant hearts. He'd put it aside 8 months ago because even his partial translation of the first 3 pages had made it clear the text operated at a theoretical and philosophical level his practical-minded reading had struggled with. He carried it to the table. Set it down. Opened to the first page. These letters are written not for scholars but for those who have already arrived at the threshold and need to understand what the threshold is, the introduction read, in the careful old script that he now moved through slowly but comprehensively. If you are reading this and the words mean nothing to you, put it down and live more of your life. If you are reading this and the words mean something, if there's a warmth in your chest that answers to a name you did not give it, then read carefully, because what we are describing has happened very rarely, and is almost always misunderstood. He stopped. Read that passage again. A warmth in your chest that answers to a name you did not give it. Yeah, he said quietly, to no one. Then, inward, you reading this with me? Obviously, Kurama said from the familiar place behind his sternum. Her voice felt different through the new resonance. Still hers, unmistakably, but with more texture, more dimension, like hearing a familiar piece of music played on a better instrument. I've been waiting for you to find that one for 3 months. You could have just told me to read it. I could have, she agreed, with a flatness that communicated without further elaboration that she had her reasons, and he was not going to get them immediately. He turned back to the text. The Kyushin no Fumi was organized, he discovered over the next 2 hours, not as a technical manual but as a series of accounts. Letters, as the title said, written by Uzumaki clan members across multiple generations who had each experienced some degree of the Jinchuriki Bijou resonance phenomenon, though at varying levels of depth. The first few letters were historical, almost archaeological, accounts from the clan's early period, when their understanding of what was happening was imprecise and they described the experience in purely mystical terms, as the fox speaking in the blood and the fire that does not burn. As the letters progressed through generations, the language became more precise, the understanding more sophisticated. The Uzumaki clan's collective knowledge building brick by brick into something that was still incomplete but was the most complete record that existed. The fox's mastery appeared first in the 14th letter, written by a woman named Uzumaki Kiyomi, who identified herself as a Jinchuriki of the nine-tailed fox roughly 300 years before the founding of Konoha. I have spent 20 years inside this bond, she wrote, and I have come to understand something that I believe has never been recorded. Perhaps because those who reached this understanding did not survive it, or did not think it worth writing down, or did not believe anyone would believe them. I will write it anyway. The bijou are not sealed into us. The terminology is wrong and has always been wrong, and I wonder sometimes if it was made wrong deliberately, by those who had reasons to want the arrangement to seem more containment than covenant. What actually happens, what I have lived inside for 2 decades and have finally come to see clearly, is that two forms of life that are not naturally compatible have found a way to share the same space. And what happens to any two things that share the same space for long enough is, they change each other. The chakra arts that the texts call the fox's mastery are not a technique in the way that the Uzumaki clan usually means technique. You cannot learn them from a scroll and perform them with correct hand seals. You can only discover them by arriving at a state where the bijou's essence and your own are genuinely, mutually known, where there is nothing hidden, nothing contained by force, nothing that the other does not understand. It is, in the old language, Kyushin, resonant hearts, and it is the most frightening and most beautiful thing I have experienced in my life, and I recommend it to no one, and I would not undo it for anything. Naruto sat back from the text. His tea had gone cold without him noticing. She's describing us, he thought. Yes. Kurama's voice was quiet. She is describing us. Did you know her? A pause. She was, not unkind to me. Kinder than most. But she did not reach as far as you have. Another pause longer. None of them did. I don't say that to flatter you. It's a factual observation, and it has caused me significant inconvenience. Inconvenience, he repeated, and he felt the flicker of something that might have been humor move through the new resonance between them, carrying what he could only describe as warmth with an edge of self-consciousness, and he understood with sudden clarity that what he was feeling was not his own emotion but Kurama's, bleeding through the changed seal like light through new glass, and that she was aware he could feel it, and was not stopping it. He turned back to the book. Kept reading. By mid-morning, he had filled a dozen pages of notes in his own shorthand, a hybrid of standard Konoha script and the Uzumaki archaic that he'd developed over the last year and a half of research. He had also consumed 4 cups of tea without tasting any of them and had forgotten entirely that he hadn't eaten breakfast. What he had learned, synthesized across the accounts in the Kyushin no Fumi and 2 supplementary texts he'd pulled from the same section. The fox's mastery was the result of a specific developmental process in the Jinchuriki-bijou relationship, one that could not be forced or artificially accelerated, but that, once begun naturally, followed a consistent progression. The Uzumaki scholars of Kiyomi's generation had identified 3 stages, which later letters refined and expanded. The first stage was what they called mesame, awakening. This was the point at which both parties in the bond ceased to experience each other as purely other. Not friendship, not alliance, just the ending of the fundamental perception of the other as entirely foreign. He'd passed through this years ago, probably around the time he was 16, possibly earlier. The second stage was Kyudo, shared resonance. This was the stage that he was, the text increasingly suggested, currently in, or had just entered. The seal changing, the bijou's form shifting to reflect the relationship rather than the containment. The emotional permeability he noticed this morning, feelings moving through the resonance in both directions. The text described this stage as frequently alarming and often mistaken for instability, and he appreciated the honesty. The third stage, kansei, completion, was the fox's mastery itself. This was described differently in every account that touched on it, because every account that touched on it was written by someone who was either approaching it theoretically or had experienced only its edges. The closest thing to a direct description came from the very last letter in the volume, written by an unnamed author who had simply signed with the Uzumaki spiral. I will not describe what the completion feels like because I don't believe language does it justice and because I believe the experience must be discovered rather than described. What I will say is this: when you arrive there, and if you arrive there, what passes between you will leave either of you unchanged. The biju's deepest power will be accessible to you, not as a weapon but as a shared thing, a living thing, something generated between two forms of consciousness that have become genuinely transparent to one another. And what is generated between two living things that have become truly transparent to each other is not technique. It is not chakra in the ordinary sense. It is something older, and the Uzumaki in their oldest texts had a name for it that translates most closely as the force through which the world continues to choose to exist. Be careful, the unnamed author had added, in what appeared to be different ink, written at a different time, perhaps later. Not because it will harm you, because it will matter to you more than anything else you have ever done. And things that matter that much change the shape of your life in ways you cannot predict. He closed the book very carefully. Set it on the table with both hands. Then he sat for a while in the quiet of the archive, listening to the sound of the building around him and the distant sounds of the village outside. And he let the information sit in him the way you let a stone settle to the bottom of still water. Kurama, he thought. Still here, she said. The third stage. The completion. You've read the same texts I have. You know more than the texts say. What is it, actually? Silence. Not the absent silence of before, but a considered one, the silence of someone deciding how much to say. It is, she said finally, exactly what the last letter describes. And I am not going to tell you more than that, because they are right that it cannot be described. It can only be reached. A pause. What I will tell you is that the progression has already begun. The seal changing last night, that is the beginning of the second stage completing itself. The third stage follows when both parties are ready. How will I know when we're ready? You'll know, she said, because I'll tell you. Another pause. And because the training will be done, he straightened. The training. There are things you need to learn before the completion becomes possible. Not techniques in the scroll and hand seals sense. More fundamental than that. The way you experience chakra, the way you perceive it, listen to it, move with it rather than through it, needs to be different from how any shinobi has been trained to work with chakra, because what the third stage requires is not control. It is something closer to the opposite of control. A long pause. I will teach you. Starting tonight in the mindscape. But there is something you should do first. What? Go eat breakfast. You've been sitting in that room for 4 hours and you haven't eaten since yesterday evening, and I can feel your blood sugar from in here, and it's irritating. He looked at his cold tea. Fair, he said aloud. He was halfway down the stairs when he nearly walked directly into Sakura. She was coming up, presumably also heading to the archives for research, a scroll tucked under one arm and a cup of something that smelled like green tea in her hand. And she stopped 2 steps below him and looked up with the expression of someone whose morning had not quite gone, as expected. Naruto. You look terrible. Good morning to you too, he said. No, I mean, she peered at him with the specific focus of a medic examining something interesting. You look tired. Not stayed up too late tired. Something else. Are you sleeping? I was on the roof most of the night, he admitted. Meditating. For how long? Since, maybe 9 o'clock? She stared at him. That's 9 hours, Naruto. I didn't notice. That's the part that's concerning. She stepped up to the same stair he was on, and put her hand against his forehead. Not a check for fever gesture but a medic's one, her chakra extending briefly against his skin, reading something under the surface. He felt it the way he always did, that particular medical green sensation. But this time he also felt Kurama's awareness sharpen behind his sternum at the contact. Alert, but not hostile. Watching, Sakura pulled her hand back. Her expression had shifted from concern to very carefully neutral in the specific way that meant she was still processing. Your chakra signature is different, she said. Different how? I'm not sure yet. She frowned. It's still yours. But there's something in the baseline that's layered. More complex than it was last week. She looked at him with the eyes that had gotten very, very good at reading things people weren't saying since she'd started spending serious time as a medic. Has something changed? He considered the question. Sakura was not someone he lied to, had never been someone he lied to, even when he was a kid and lying had felt like his first and best defense mechanism. She was also extremely perceptive and would figure out that he was withholding something within about 6 minutes if he tried. Yes, he said, Something's changing. I'm still figuring out what it is. With Kurama? Yeah. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she stepped aside on the stairs to let him pass. Come by the hospital this week, she said. I want to do a full chakra diagnostic when you're not in the middle of figuring it out. Just so we have a baseline. Yeah, okay. And eat something, she added. You're too tall to skip meals. Why does everyone keep saying that? He muttered, and continued down the stairs. Ichiraku's was the obvious destination. It was always the obvious destination. Tochigi already had a bowl waiting by the time Naruto ducked under the curtain. Miso, extra pork, a portion of greens that the man had started including without being asked sometime in the last year, on the grounds that ninja burned too many calories to survive on broth and noodles alone, no matter what some ninjas seemed to believe about their own dietary requirements. You were on the roof again, Tochi said. It wasn't a question. Does the whole village know I meditate on my roof? It's a small village, the old man said placidly, and you're distinctive. Eat. He ate. The miso was perfect the way it always was. Ayam appeared from the back to refill his water without being asked and subjected him to a 30-second evaluation that was somehow more thorough than Sakura's and ended with a declaration that he needed a haircut. He sat in the familiar warm space of the stand and let the day settle around him. The morning market sounds, a couple of kids running past, two chunin discussing a mission debrief a few stands down, and let himself just exist in the ordinary world for a minute. You like this place, Kurama said. Not a question. Always have. I know. I remember. A pause that had something soft in it, something she wasn't drawing attention to. The first time you came here after the Mizuki incident, you were 7 years old, and you had been crying and you tried very hard not to show it. He kept eating, but he felt something move through the resonance that he recognized now as his own emotion being perceived from the other side, a strange recursion, feeling himself being felt. You remember that? I remember everything about your life that I was present for. Which is all of it. A pause. I did not always pay close attention. In the early years I did not want to. You were. I was not, at that time, inclined toward compassion. Another pause. I have regretted that. Periodically. It is a new development. He set his chopsticks down for a moment. Looked at the counter. Hey Kurama, he said quietly, low enough that the background noise of the market covered his voice. Yes, thank you. For last night. For telling me what you told me. The resonance shifted. Something moving through it that was very large and very old, and had no clean human name for itself. It settled, eventually, into something that the warmth that answers to a name you did not give it, Uzumaki Kiyomi had written about, and he sat in it for a moment the way you sat in the first real warmth after a very long winter. Don't thank me, Kurama said eventually. Just learn well. He picked his chopsticks back up. Yes ma'am, he thought, and he felt the flicker of her exasperation and the warmth underneath it, and he smiled into his bowl in a way that Tochigi, who had known this boy since he was old enough to climb onto a barstool, noticed immediately, and said nothing about, having learned long ago that some things were simply not his business. The rest of the day was ordinary, which felt important. He ran through his morning training routine, the solo kata he developed after the war that combined taijutsu flow with early sage chakra management, and then spent 2 hours working with a team of chunin on coordination exercises that Kakashi had assigned him as part of an ongoing conversation about whether Naruto was maintaining skills that didn't scale with his power level. Kakashi's argument: yes, you need to know how to work with people who aren't you. Naruto's argument: I know how to do that. Kakashi's response: demonstrated 3 times a week. Then he ran a patrol loop around the outer perimeter of the village in the early afternoon, and stopped to help a team of genin retrieve a mission target that had gotten significantly more complicated than their D-rank briefing had suggested, which took 45 minutes and involved a very annoyed bear. Through all of it, the new quality of the resonance was present, not intrusive, not destabilizing, but there, layered into the background of his awareness the way the sound of your own heartbeat was always there once you started listening for it. Kurama was there too, more present than usual, though she said very little. He had the sense of her paying attention to things, observing the chunin team with an analytical interest she'd never bothered with before. Noting the bear incident was something that was definitively not amusement, but was its close neighbor, listening to the sounds of the village with an attentiveness that felt new. "You're looking at everything differently," he observed, during the perimeter run. "I've been in a seal for 20 years, she said. Everything I've seen of the world I've seen through you. I never bothered to, actually observe it. Before." A pause. "You notice things I do not." The old man at the ramen stand. The way the chunin in the second exercise was protecting her left side. Another pause, shorter. "And I notice things you do not. The chakra of the roots of the trees in the east section of the perimeter. The way the air pressure has shifted in the last hour. The very faint scent of iron in the water from the northern well that should probably be reported to maintenance. I'll mention the well. How long have you been noticing that?" 3 days. I didn't think it was relevant enough to mention until I had something to compare it to. Kurama. Infrastructure concerns are always relevant. I'll try to remember that my encyclopedic knowledge of bijou warfare and ancient chakra theory should be redirected toward municipal water systems. He laughed, out loud, in the middle of the empty perimeter path. A crow sitting in a tree above him gave him a withering look and flew off. He went to the mindscape that evening just after sunset, settling into meditation in the apartment properly this time, cushion on the floor, back against the wall. Candlelit because he'd found years ago that having a physical anchor helped him move in and out of the deeper states without the disorientation that occasionally came with the transition. The mindscape felt different now that he knew what he was looking at. The threshold was still there, the 2 stone pillars with their ofuda, and 3 of the ofuda were still burning. But the fire was quieter now, steadier, less alarming. The trees were still red, but there was gold in them too, coming through as the light inside shifted towards something warmer. He passed through the threshold and followed the path to the old clearing, and Kurama was there, in the same posture as the night before, though she moved slightly, less curled, more settled, as if the clearing had become more comfortable in the hours since he'd last been in it. She looked at him when he arrived and said, without preamble, "We begin with sound." He sat down across from her. "Sound. Chakra," she said, "as you have been trained to perceive it, as all shinobi are trained to perceive it, is treated primarily as a force. Something you move, shape, control, deploy. The entire history of ninjutsu is a history of the refinement of control. The force increases, the control improves. The techniques become more sophisticated expressions of the fundamental premise that chakra is a material to be worked." She looked at him steadily. "That framework is not wrong. But it is incomplete. And what I am going to teach you requires a different framework entirely." "What framework?" "Sound," she repeated. "Not literally, though the metaphor holds better than most. Chakra is not just a force. It has frequency, rhythm, tone. Every living thing that generates chakra generates it at its own particular frequency, as individual as a voice, as consistent as a heartbeat. 2 chakra sources in proximity influence each other the way 2 sound sources in the same space influence each other. Harmony or interference. Resonance or cancellation." She tilted her head, the fox ears shifting. "What you have been learning to do, what we have been building toward for years, whether either of us was conscious of it, is resonance. The second stage of the Kyushin progression is the point at which your chakra frequency and mine have aligned closely enough that the seal itself responds. What I am going to teach you is to hear that frequency. To listen for it consciously and deliberately, rather than having it happen to you." "How?" "Stop generating," she said. He blinked. "Stop. You are always generating chakra. Every moment of your waking life, you are actively producing and circulating chakra through your system. It is not something you think about. It is as automatic as breathing, but it creates interference. Background signal. In the same way that you cannot hear a very quiet sound in a loud room." She looked at him with those layered red eyes. "I am going to teach you to be quiet, to reduce your own output to the minimum necessary for basic biological function, and to listen for what remains when the interference is cleared. Is that like the sage mode preparation?" "Completely stilling the comparable but distinct," she said. "Sage mode requires you to become receptive to natural energy from outside yourself. What I'm describing requires you to become receptive to the chakra that is already inside you." "My chakra." "The resonance. You have been feeling it passively for years." Her tails shifted, slow and deliberate. "I want you to hear it." He sat with that. nodded. How long will this take? As long as it takes. She said it without impatience, which was itself a change. We don't have a deadline. The progression moves when the learning is real, not when the clock says it should be. A pause. Now close your eyes. And stop pushing. He closed his eyes, and in the red-gold clearing inside the center of himself, with the seal burning its quiet transformation at the edges and the ancient trees standing their patient watch, he began to learn to listen. He didn't get it that night. He didn't expect to. What he got was the beginning of understanding what he was listening for, a faint thread of something, distinct from his own chakra output, that moved at a rhythm that was older and slower and more immense than anything he generated himself. He found it for approximately 4 seconds near the end of the session, in the space after he'd successfully reduced his own output to something close to what Kurama was describing. And it was not a sound, exactly, not a chakra sensation in any sense he had words for, but something between the two, something that resonated in the part of him that was more fundamental than either physical sensation or rational thought. Then he lost it. Reached for it. Lost it further. Don't chase it, Kurama said. That's the interference. Notice that you noticed, and let go. He tried. He mostly failed. But the shape of what he was reaching toward was now in his awareness, the way a scent could orient you in a dark room. He surfaced from the mindscape around midnight, the candle burned down to a stub, his body stiff from the hours of stillness. He sat for a moment in the dim apartment, feeling the resonance hum its new familiar background note, and thought about nothing in particular. Then he got up and noted down the water well issue for the maintenance report. Then he ate the rice he'd left on the stove. Then he went to bed and slept, for the first time in a while, without dreaming. In the morning, the world was the same. He was still not. But he was beginning to understand slowly, in the way that all the things that actually mattered had ever been understood, not in a flash but in an accumulation. Not in a revelation but in a return, again and again, to the same quiet listening place, that he was ready to learn what came next. 3 weeks into the training, Naruto could hold the stillness for 11 minutes. He knew the exact number because Kurama counted, with the particular precision of someone who had spent millennia with nothing to do but observe time passing and had consequently developed a relationship with it that was extremely accurate and not especially sympathetic. 11 minutes and then the interference crept back in, his own chakra output reasserting itself with the biological stubbornness of a reflex, and the thin, clear thread of the resonance would blur and then vanish, and he would surface from the depth of the listening with the frustration of a man who had just watched something he needed slip back below the surface of dark water. 11 is better than 9, Kurama said, on the 22nd night of training. I know. He was sitting at the base of the great red tree, back against the trunk, because somewhere in the second week he'd stopped being careful about the distance between them and started simply sitting where it was comfortable, which was close. She was curled a few feet to his left, tails arranged in the loose, settled way that he'd come to understand meant she was at ease. It was at 9 for 4 days. Progress is not linear. You sound like Irika-sensei. I sound, she said with precision, nothing like Irika-sensei. I have heard Irika-sensei through your ears and he is considerably more encouraging and has better facial expressions. He smiled at the dark above him. The canopy of the great tree was too dense to see through, but there was a light that came from somewhere inside it, amber and slow pulsing, that gave the clearing its warmth. Are you saying you don't have good facial expressions? I'm saying I have 9 tails and the weight of 10,000 years of existence, and that my effect communicates differently than a schoolteacher's. Your effect is fine, he said. I can read you. A pause. Loaded in a specific way he was getting familiar with. The pause that meant something had landed differently than she'd anticipated, and she was deciding what to do about it. You're getting better at that, she said finally. Her voice was level, but he felt through the resonance the thing underneath the level. Something that moved like the surface of deep water when something large passed underneath. The resonance is clearer. It has been clearer since the 4th day. He turned his head to look at her. In the amber light of the clearing, the fur along her flank rose and fell with her breathing, a motion he'd noticed recently, how she breathed in the mindscape, how she had a rhythm to it. He'd asked her once if Bijou needed to breathe and she'd given him a long, complicated answer about the nature of spiritual manifestation and the way physical patterns persisted in metaphysical spaces, and had concluded with the observation that it was complicated and he should not read too much into it. He had read into it anyway. "Tell me something," he said. "Depending on what something is. The other Jinchuriki. The other Bijou." He watched her ears shift. "Do you ever sense them? Now that the war is over and everyone is, do you ever feel Gyuki? Or Shikaku?" She was quiet for a moment. The thoughtful quiet, not the guarded one, he could tell the difference now, had been able to for about a week, which remained slightly disorienting. Distantly, she said. "The way you might sense a fire from 3 hills away. The warmth, not the flame. The Bijou are, we are not unconnected, even in our separate seals. We were once one thing. That doesn't simply disappear." A pause. "Shikaku is, as he has always been, deeply irritating. Gyuki has better temperament. Son Goku is proud and slow to forget injury. Matatabi is fastidious." He filed this away with the rest of the Bijou lore she'd shared across the weeks of training, fragments, offered not as lectures but as things that surfaced naturally when the conversation went a certain way. He'd stopped trying to take notes during the Mindscape sessions because she'd pointed out, with some accuracy, that he retained the things he actually cared about without writing them down, and the writing was a way of trying to hold everything rather than letting himself discover what he needed. She was right. He hated when she was right. She was right frequently. "Do they know?" he asked. "Gyuki, Shikaku, do they sense that something is changing here? Perhaps." She looked at him with those layered eyes. "Does it matter? Killer Bee is a friend. Gaara is basically family. If something is happening to me, to both of us, that's going to be visible to them eventually. I'd rather they hear it from me then." "Nothing has happened yet," she said. "We are in preparation. When there is something to tell, you can tell them." A pause. "Naruto, yeah, you are doing that thing where you look forward to the consequences before you've reached the event itself. You have done this since childhood. You run 17 steps ahead and then run back and then run forward again, and exhaust yourself before anything has actually occurred." He opened his mouth. Closed it. "That's pretty accurate. I know. I've watched you do it for 20 years. There was something in her voice that was not quite warmth, and not quite exasperation, but lived in the space between them, the way a lot of what she communicated was learning to live in spaces he didn't previously have names for. "Be here. Practice." He settled back against the tree. Closed his eyes. Breathed through the first phase of the stilling, the part that took about 3 minutes, slowing the output down from its automatic flow to something more deliberate, and then to something quieter than that. Layer by layer, like dimming a lamp rather than extinguishing it. He'd gotten better at this part. The slow was easier than the still. The still was where it got difficult. There was a specific quality to his own chakra output that he never noticed before Kurama started teaching him to listen for it. An activity, a hum, something that he'd always experienced as simply himself, and had never distinguished from the background of existing. It was like being asked to notice the sound of your own breathing. Once you noticed it, it was hard to unnotice. And what she was asking him to do was to quiet it, not stop it, because that would be dying in a fairly literal sense, but reduce it to something as minimal as possible, a whisper rather than a voice. 11 minutes before, he could hold that whisper. He reached for it now. Found the level, held it, felt the familiar weight of Kurama's chakra beneath his own frequency, vast and old and moving at its own rhythm entirely. And then beneath that, threading through both like a single clear note struck on a string, the resonance. He had been hearing it for about a week, genuinely hearing it, not just feeling it as a vague presence. It was distinct from Kurama's chakra and distinct from his own. It was not made of either, or rather it was made of both in a proportion that had no equivalent in any mixing he'd done before. Not the red-orange surge of Kurama's power channeled through his hands in combat. Not the sage calm of natural energy drawn in from outside, not anything he had a prior framework for. It existed in the overlap, in the place where his frequency and hers had been in proximity long enough to generate something that belonged to neither and to both. He held it. 11 minutes. He reached 12. Felt the effort of the 12 starting to crack at the edges. Let the crack happen. 13. Holding the breath of the thing rather than the thing itself. And at 13.5 minutes the interference rushed back in and the resonance blurred and disappeared and he was back to simply being himself in the ordinary sense. He opened his eyes. Kurama was watching him with an expression he didn't see on her face often. Focused, intent, something that in a less ancient, an enormous being he might have called impressed. 13, she said, closer to 13.5. I was rounding down out of discipline. But the thing that wasn't quite warmth moved through the resonance. And he felt it clearly now the way you felt a change in the wind. And he couldn't help smiling. Am I getting close to the next part? He asked. Define close. Are we talking weeks or months? She considered. The duration of holding is not the only variable. The other variable is what you encounter inside the stillness. She looked at him steadily. You've been holding the resonance, and staying at the surface of it. You haven't gone deeper. Deeper how? The resonance it is not a single point. It's a connection. A bridge. She seemed to be choosing her words carefully, which was not unusual. She was always choosing her words carefully. But there was a different quality to it now. Something that felt less like choosing for precision and more like choosing because the territory was one she'd been approaching cautiously. You've been standing at the entrance to the bridge. When you're ready, and I'm saying this not as encouragement but as information, the next step is to walk out onto it. And what's on the other side? She looked at him for a long moment. Me, she said. More of me than you have had access to before. More than I have offered to anyone before. A pause. I want to be clear about that so you understand what the next stage of this involves. What the Fox's mastery requires, at the completion, is full transparency between us. No distance. Nothing I'm keeping behind a barrier, nothing you're keeping behind one. The bridge has to be traveled. Both ways. He absorbed this quietly. Both ways, he repeated. You will have access to much of what I am. Memories. The weight of 10,000 years. I can't fully prepare you for what that's like, because I have never shared it with anyone and I don't know exactly what it will feel like from your side. Her tails shifted, a slow movement that he'd learned to read as something between discomfort and resolve. And I will have equivalent access to you. He thought about that. Everything he'd ever felt, everything he'd ever been. The years of loneliness. The things he'd never told anyone. The grief he still carried for the people the war had taken. The hope that had, in the years after, slowly rebuilt itself from something desperate into something real. Okay, he said. She looked at him. I mean it, he said. There's nothing I'm afraid for you to see. There might be things that are embarrassing, and I'd appreciate if you didn't mention those too specifically, but Naruto. Yeah. Do you know how many people, she said, with a careful deliberateness that he recognized as her managing emotion she wasn't accustomed to expressing, have said something like that to me, in 10,000 years. He thought about it. The text suggests, maybe 2 or 3 who got close. 0, she said. None. Not one. She looked away from him, toward the edge of the clearing where the red gold trees stood in their patient rows. Not because they were bad people, many of them, because the nature of the arrangement made it, because I was what I was to them. An entity to be contained. Even the ones who grew to respect me, even Kiyomi who was kinder than most. There was always the knowledge, for both of us, that if the containment failed, the result was catastrophe. That knowledge does not create the conditions for this. He looked at her profile in the amber light. The line of her jaw, the sweep of the ears, the way the 9 tails lay in their loose arrangement around her. She looked ancient, which she was. She also looked, in this moment, like something that had been carrying a weight for longer than any weight should be carried. I know, he said quietly. You are the first, she said, still looking at the trees, who has ever sat in this clearing and made me feel that the weight has somewhere to go. The resonance moved between them, his feeling of her feeling, the recursive loop of it, and what came through from her side was something so large, and so old, and so carefully held for so long that he didn't have a word for it. He just sat in it. Didn't try to name it. Let it be what it was. After a while, she looked back at him. Next session, she said, and her voice was fully level again, the professional precision restored, we go deeper. You walk out onto the bridge. A pause. Bring all of yourself. Don't leave anything outside. The bridge holds better with full weight than with partial weight. That's a metaphor I'm going to be thinking about for a while. Good, she said. Think about it. Understanding it in your body before you attempt it physically will help. She turned her gaze back to the canopy. Go sleep. Your cortisol levels are telling me things that are not flattering. Now you're monitoring my cortisol? I monitor everything. Go to sleep. He went. The thing about changing was that you couldn't always see it happening to yourself. He noticed it first in other people's reactions. Hanada noticed on a Tuesday. She found him in the market buying vegetables with the focused expression of someone trying to remember which ones he'd been told to buy and failing to remember approximately half of them. And she stopped next to him and said his name, and he turned, and she went very still in the specific way she'd mostly outgrown since they'd gotten older and comfortable with one another. Your eyes, she said. He blinked. What about them? There, she looked for the word. They're the right color. Blue. But there's something. She reached up, without quite seeming to decide to, and held her hand near his face without touching it. Her Byakugan activated, the veins at her temples, the expanded perception. She held it for a moment, and then let it release, and her expression was one he couldn't immediately read. There's a second chakra signature, right alongside yours, she said. Not separate. Integrated. It's always been there, but it wasn't woven into yours like that before. It was adjacent. Now it's, yeah, he said. She looked at him for another moment. Then she picked up a leek from the market stall, examined it, and put it in his basket without asking. These, she said, and the onions there, and the mushrooms at the third stall. I knew those, he said. You were looking at the turnips with an expression of genuine uncertainty. I was thinking about something else, he said, and she smiled, the quiet real smile she'd had since they were kids, and didn't ask what he was thinking about because she had always been very good at knowing which things to ask and which things to wait for. He told her, walking home from the market, in the abbreviated version that he was developing for different people, calibrated to what they could absorb and what he understood well enough to explain. The Jinchuriki Bijaban. The resonance. The Uzumaki texts. He didn't tell her everything, partly because he didn't fully understand everything himself yet, and partly because some of it felt like it belonged to him and Kurama before it belonged to the wider world. She listened the way she always listened, completely, without the impulse to interrupt or redirect that some of his other friends struggled with. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Is it frightening? She asked. He thought about it seriously. No. Which maybe should be more alarming than it is. Maybe, she said, it isn't frightening because it's right. He thought about that all the way home. Sasuke came to find him on a Thursday. He arrived without announcement, which was his way, appearing in places the way shadows appeared, without the social forewarning that most people considered baseline courtesy. Naruto had stopped being annoyed by this approximately 2 years ago, and had replaced the annoyance with a form of resigned affection that he suspected Sasuke would hate knowing about. He was training in the East Field when Sasuke arrived. The solo kata, the blending of Sage and Bijou chakra and the slow, flowing movements that he'd developed with Kurama's guidance. Something that looked less like a conventional training routine and more like a moving meditation. He was deep enough in it that he heard Sasuke's approach without breaking the movement, noted the chakra signature, and finished the sequence before turning. Sasuke stood at the edge of the field with his arms crossed and his expression in its default setting, the one that took years of investment to read accurately, and that most people gave up on and interpreted as cold. It was not cold. It was a face that had learned, very young, that expression was vulnerability, and had built a wall with that understanding, and was still, years later, slowly and stubbornly dismantling the wall one stone at a time. He was looking at Naruto with an expression that was the Sasuke equivalent of deeply concerned. You're different, he said. Good morning to you too, Naruto said. Sasuke walked toward him. Stopped about 10 feet away. His Sharingan activated, just briefly, the tomo spinning, reading something. Then he let it close again. Your chakra is, I know. It's not just the fox's chakra mixed with yours. There's a third element. He studied Naruto with the focus of someone running diagnostics. What are you doing? Learning something, Naruto said. Something old. From the Uzumaki archives. From the fox. With Kurama. Yeah. He watched Sasuke's expression process this. The Sharingan's pattern recognition was, he'd always known, at an abstract level, that the eye read chakra signatures and patterns at a level beyond ordinary perception. Being read by it now, with the changes in his own chakra system, felt different. More exposed. She's teaching me. The bond between Jinchuriki and Bijou, when it reaches a specific depth, apparently produces something the Uzumaki clan called. I can feel it from here, Sasuke said. He hadn't moved. The third element. It's not chakra the way chakra is chakra. It's, like the frequency underneath? Naruto said. Sasuke looked at him sharply. Yes, the texts call it the resonance. It's what builds between the Jinchuriki and the Bijou when the bond becomes genuinely mutual. He watched his friend process this. I know how it sounds. It doesn't sound like anything yet, Sasuke said. I don't have a category for it. He was quiet for a moment. Is it dangerous? I don't know, Naruto said honestly. Not in the sense of destabilizing. Not to me or to the village. The text suggests it's the opposite of dangerous, in a way, that the more complete the resonance becomes, the more stable everything gets. He paused. But what comes at the end of the progression is something new, something that hasn't existed before, or has existed only once or twice in recorded history. So in that sense, it's unknown, and unknown things can always turn out to be dangerous. Sasuke was quiet for a long time. The east field was full of morning birdsong and the distant sound of the training grounds further west where a group of Chunin were running through drills. I'm going to be nearby, Sasuke said finally. Not a question. Not a request for permission. I know, Naruto said. Not because I think you're going to lose control of yourself, Sasuke said, with the careful precision of someone clarifying terms. Because when something happens that you haven't been able to predict, it's useful to have someone close who can perceive it accurately. I know, Naruto said again. Sasuke. What? Thank you? Sasuke looked at him for a moment. The expression behind the default wall moved. Something crossed it that was brief and real and immediately smoothed over. He turned and walked away across the field without another word, which was entirely consistent with who he was, and Naruto watched him go with the fondness that he'd long ago accepted was simply a permanent feature of how he felt about that particular person. He's worried, Kurama observed from her place in the resonance. Yeah, it's reasonable, she said, which was as close as she'd ever come to saying something positive about Sasuke. He reads chakra accurately, and he perceives that what is happening here is significant. His instinct to be proximate is a pause. Appropriate. High praise coming from you. Don't push it, she said, but the warmth was there underneath it, real and present, and he smiled at the morning sky as he turned back to his training. The night he walked out onto the bridge was a quiet one. No particular drama surrounded it. No special preparation, no ceremony. He settled into the mindscape the same way he had every night for the last 3 weeks. Cushion, candle, the slow descent through the layers, and arrived in the clearing to find Kurama already there, already watching him, and something in the quality of the amber light was different. Deeper. Older. Tonight? He said, if you're ready, I'm ready. She looked at him for a long, measuring moment. Then she stood, fully, uncurling from her settled position and rising to her full height in this form, which was tall enough that he had to tilt his head back slightly. And she walked toward him with a deliberateness that made the air in the clearing feel heavier, more charged. She stopped close enough that he could feel the warmth of her chakra on his skin even here in the mindscape. Not the combat surge of it but the ambient warmth, the simple fact of how much she was radiating outward the way the sun radiated even when you weren't looking at it. Close your eyes, she said. Go into the stillness. Find the resonance. And then, she paused. Don't stop where you always stop. Don't hold it at the surface. Follow it. Follow it where? You'll know, she said. It only goes one direction from the surface. He closed his eyes. The stilling was faster now. He was down to about 2 minutes for the first phases. The muscle memory building up the way physical muscle memory did, his chakra system learning the pattern and beginning to automate the descent. He found the whisper. Held it. Found the resonance underneath, clear and present and humming that particular frequency that had no name in any language he knew. He'd always stopped here. Held the frequency and examined it from where he stood, like looking at something through a window and noting its features without opening the door. He opened the door. It was not a violent thing. It was not a surge or a breaking or any of the dramatic metaphors he might have prepared for. It was precisely what Kurama had said. Walking out onto the bridge, taking one step and then another, following the resonance the way you followed a path you could feel but not see in the dark, trusting the ground to be there. And then he felt her, not the way he'd been feeling her, the secondary presence, the background warmth, the emotions bleeding through the resonance in their new familiar way. This was entirely different. This was like being in a room with a wall between you and someone for years, hearing them through it, learning the sound of their movements, and their breathing and the way their voice carried through stone, and then the wall being gone, and standing in the same space with nothing between you for the first time. She was immense. He'd known she was immense. He'd known it intellectually, experientially, had fought alongside that immensity and been dwarfed by it in combat. But knowing the scale of something and standing in the full presence of it were different things, and what he stood in now was the full presence of 10,000 years of living awareness, of something that had existed before the word shinobi was invented, before Konoha was a dream, before the land of fire was a name rather than just a place where fires burned. He felt her history the way you felt a landscape from a height, not every detail, not every memory, but the shape of it. The enormous span. The grief of the separation from wholeness, the centuries of fear and weaponization, the isolation of the sealed existence, long dark years inside his predecessors, some kind and some not. The anger, the rage that had not come from nowhere but from being treated as a force rather than a being for as long as being was something she'd been. He felt her feel him feel her, the recursive loop of the resonance at full depth, her awareness of his awareness of hers, folding back on itself. And in that fold something that was either of them and both of them, the third thing, the resonance itself having its own experience of the connection it described. He felt her feel the years. His years. The loneliness that had grown so familiar he'd stopped noticing it the way you stopped noticing a scar. The love for the village that had always been complicated by the village's relationship with him, and had resolved, slowly, painfully, into something that was no longer contingent on being loved back. The friends who had become family. The grief for Jiraiya that still lived in a specific corner of his chest and was not diminishing but was becoming something different, sediment, the grief of rivers, the way loss became part of the landscape. She was seeing it all. He felt her seeing it, and she did not, he had expected, in the part of him that still anticipated rejection, some quality of judgment, some evaluation. The vast and ancient intelligence that had seen everything he'd ever been or thought or done or hidden. He'd expected it to find something inadequate, something that confirmed the old story about himself that he'd spent 20 years slowly rewriting. What he felt instead was something that had no clean human name. The closest he could get to it, sitting in the clearing in the mindscape with tears running down his face that he didn't notice for several minutes, was witnessed. To be fully seen by something that fully understood what it was seeing and found nothing in that view that it wished were otherwise. He felt her feel it happen. Her surprise at her own response. The thing she'd been building toward naming for years, the thing she'd said she had no word for, finding its edges in this moment, this full mutual exposure. It wasn't something either of them had created. It was something the resonance had always been pointing toward, from the first night years ago, when he looked her in the eye and refused to be afraid. They stayed in it for a long time. Long enough that the amber light in the clearing shifted through its full cycle and returned. Long enough that the things being communicated in both directions were things that had never been said and might not need to be said with words. When he finally surfaced, when the depth released him gently, the bridge walking itself back rather than him withdrawing, the candle in his apartment was out, and the room was very dark, and there were tears drying on his face. He sat in the dark for a while. Kurama, he thought. The resonance was the fullest it had ever been. Not louder, deeper. Like the difference between a sound and the space a sound filled. I know, she said. He nodded at nothing. Put his hands on his knees. Breathed. Okay, he said to the dark room. Okay. He heard her. Not words, not even emotion, exactly. Something underneath both of those. The first syllable of a language that had been waiting for them to learn it. Outside, Konoha slept its warm and ordinary sleep, unaware that something in the long history of the world had just shifted by a degree so small and so fundamental that no instrument in any village could have measured it. And on the 6th floor of the Hokage Tower's administrative annex, in the monitoring office that tracked unusual chakra activity within the village borders, an ANBU on overnight duty sat up straight and looked at the display panel with an expression of confusion, because the signature it was showing him did not match any classification in the database, and it was emanating from a Konoha residential address he recognized, and it was not hostile. It was not remotely hostile. But it was not anything he had parameters for, and he wrote it in the log with 3 question marks beside it, and flagged it for morning review. In the morning, the file would reach Kakashi. That was a problem for tomorrow. Tonight, in the quiet dark of an apartment in the village he loved, Naruto Uzumaki sat with his hands on his knees and his face tilted upward and let the resonance hum in the depth of him, and felt for the first time in his life that there was no part of himself that was unknown to the universe. It was, he thought, a very strange and very good feeling. He went to the Uzumaki archives the next morning and found the last unnamed letter again, the one that ended with "Be careful, not because it will harm you, because it will matter to you more than anything else you have ever done." He read it 3 times. Then he turned to the page after the letter, which he never examined closely because his attention had always stopped at the end of the letter itself. There, in different handwriting, older, the archaic script at its most archaic, was a single additional passage. He translated it slowly, twice, to make sure he had it right. "There is a thing that the texts do not discuss and that I have debated writing down, and have decided to write down because it is true, and the truth deserves its place even when it is complicated. When the bridge is fully walked, both ways, and the resonance reaches completion, when the fox's mastery becomes not a practice but a state, what passes between the Jinchuriki and the Bijou is generative, not metaphorically. In the deepest sense of that word. The ancients called it the breath by which the world extends itself. What is made between 2 beings who have become genuinely transparent to one another is a living thing. It takes different forms depending on the natures involved. I cannot tell you what form it takes for you. I can only tell you that it comes. That it is not something to be feared. And that of all the things I have written in my life, this is the thing I am most uncertain anyone will believe, and the most certain that is nonetheless real." He sat back from the text. He read it again. Generative, he thought. Kurama was quiet in the resonance. He felt through the connection the quality of her quiet, not the guarded quiet, not the processing quiet. Something else. Something that had a weight to it he hadn't encountered before. "Kurama," he thought. She didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was more careful than he'd heard it. "I have," she said, "been aware of this passage for some time." His pulse did something. He couldn't immediately classify what it did. "How long?" "Since before I told you about the fox's mastery. Since before I admitted that the seal was changing." A long pause. "It is part of why I waited 6 months before telling you anything. I was uncertain how to approach it." He looked at the old words on the old page. "A living thing. It takes different forms depending on the natures involved." "Kurama," he said again. "I know," she said. The resonance carried a quality that he had no name for but that moved through him with the force of something true. "I know." He sat in the archive for a long time after that. The morning light moved through the narrow windows. Ogata-san's footsteps moved through the floor below him. The village carried on its ordinary life outside, and in the space that the resonance had carved between what he had been and what he was becoming, something else entirely, something ancient and new at once. Something the unnamed author had written about with the urgency of a person who understood they were writing for someone they would never meet but who would one day need to know, waited quietly for the moment when both of them were ready to understand it. The night it happened, there was no moon. Naruto had not planned it for a moonless night, had not planned it at all, in the sense of sitting down and deciding tonight is the night. It was more that the training had reached a point where the next step was simply there. The way a door that has been gradually unlocking announces itself not by swinging open dramatically but by being, one morning, no longer locked. He put his hand on the handle. It turned. It was 4 weeks after the night he'd walked out onto the bridge. Those 4 weeks had been the strangest of his life, which was a significant distinction given the life he'd led. The depth of the resonance had not retreated after that first full contact, had not snapped back to the surface-level connection it had been before. It had settled at the new depth the way a river settled into a new channel after a flood, accepting the altered landscape as simply the landscape now. He and Kurama moved through it together, learning its new parameters, learning what full transparency actually meant in the context of daily life rather than the concentrated intensity of a mindscape session. It meant, practically speaking, that he felt her responses to things with a consistency and clarity that still occasionally caught him off guard. The morning he'd burned his breakfast, her exasperation had arrived in his chest before he'd consciously registered the smell of smoke. The afternoon a group of children in the market had stopped to stare at him. The old staring, the wary kind, from children whose parents had told them things. He'd felt her anger on his behalf, sharp and immediate and fierce, and had had to take a breath to separate it from his own steadier response. He'd also felt her delight the first time he'd deliberately shown her something beautiful. He'd done it experimentally, on a morning when the sunrise over the Hokage mountain had produced a particular arrangement of gold and rose that struck him as extraordinary, and he'd oriented his attention to it with the intention of sharing it through the resonance. And what had come back from her side was something he had not expected from something 10,000 years old. Something open and uncomplicated. The response of a being that had seen 10,000 sunrises and had, for most of them, been behind a seal in the dark. He had made a point of sharing things with her after that. She had not commented on this directly. She had started doing it in return, pointing his attention toward things she perceived through the connection that he would otherwise have missed. The specific quality of the light in the training field that late afternoon. The sound the wind made in the trees on the eastern perimeter that she described as distinct from every other tree wind sound in the village. The way certain combinations of chakra signatures created harmonics she found remarkable. It was, he thought, in the quiet between one thing and the next, the most unusual friendship he'd ever had. He was aware, with the clarity that the resonance produced, that friendship was not quite the right word anymore. He didn't have a better one. He'd been in the territory beyond the available vocabulary for some time now and had made a kind of peace with it. The training session that became the night of the Fox's Mastery began at 9 o'clock and unremarkably, he settled into the mindscape. Found the clearing, found Kurama, found the amber light and the great tree and the familiar arrangement of it all. They'd spent the past 4 weeks working on a specific aspect of the resonance. The directionality of it, Kurama called it. The bridge went 2 ways, she taught him. But the Fox's Mastery required something more than bidirectional passage. It required the bridge itself to become load-bearing in both directions simultaneously. He had been practicing holding the full depth of the connection while also generating, gently, slowly, in the way she taught him to attend to chakra as frequency rather than force, outward from the resonance itself rather than from his own chakra centers. The distinction was, as most of the distinctions in this training were, easier to describe than to do. It was the difference between playing an instrument and allowing a piece of music to play through you, with all the precision and surrender that the second thing required. He was getting better at it. He was not yet good at it. Tonight, somewhere in the 3rd hour of practice, something shifted. He felt it the way you felt the moment a knotted muscle released. Not painful, not dramatic. A simple fundamental change from resistance to ease. The generating he'd been working toward, the production from the resonance rather than from himself, stopped being effortful and became, in the span of a single breath, simply possible. Kurama went very still across the clearing. He kept the breath. Kept the channel. Felt the resonance respond to the new mode of generation the way a river responded to rain. Not filling but deepening. Not expanding in volume but increasing in some quality that didn't have a volumetric name. The frequency rose. Both their frequencies simultaneously, his and hers, moving toward each other like 2 notes, finding unison, and the clearing around him responded. The amber light brightened, the red gold trees on the perimeter swayed in a wind that wasn't coming from any physical direction. The spiraling patterns in the stone at the clearing's center began to emit a faint luminescence. He felt Kurama's chakra move, not at him. Not channeled in the combat sense. Toward him. The distinction was everything, the difference between a weapon and a hand. Her chakra moved in his direction the way a tide moved toward shore, in the way that had nothing to do with intention and everything to do with the nature of the force involved and what the landscape called. From it, their frequencies met. It was not a sound. It was not a chakra sensation in any prior definition of the term. It was both and neither, and something that lived in the register below both, in the place the unnamed Uzumaki author had called the force through which the world continues to choose to exist. He was inside it, and it was inside him, and the distinction between the two had become, in this moment, genuinely academic. He understood, in the fraction of a second before the understanding became too large for linear thought, what the fox's mastery actually was. It was not a technique. It was what happened when two forms of consciousness reached a complete enough knowledge of each other that they ceased to produce interference between them, and what was left in the absence of interference was something that had always been present but had always been obscured. The underlying frequency of existence itself. The hum beneath all hums. The thing the sage of 6 paths had touched when he divided the 10 tails, and the thing he'd been reaching for without fully grasping for all the millennia since. The clearing went supernova. Not destructively. Not outward, not into the physical world. Inward. The light in the mindscape reached a saturation point that should have been blinding and instead was simply complete. The way complete darkness was simply complete, the extreme of a spectrum becoming its own kind of neutrality. The trees were gone. The stone was gone. The seal threshold and the burning Ofuta were gone. There was only the resonance and the two beings that the resonance connected, and the resonance, at this depth and this completeness, he could not think in it. He stopped trying to think. Stopped trying to track the experience, to catalog it, to understand it in the moment of its happening. Let it happen. Let it move through him the way rivers move through landscapes, not asking the landscape's permission, not requiring the landscape to do anything except exist and be moved through. It lasted. He had no idea how long it lasted. When it ended, it did not end abruptly. It receded, the way light receded at the end of a day, gradually, warmly, leaving something changed in the sky even after it was gone. He was on his knees. He didn't remember moving from the sitting position to his knees. He was on them in the clearing, the amber light restored to its normal level, his hands flat on the warm stone of the floor, his breathing deeper and slower than he'd ever managed outside of the deepest sage meditation. The stone under his hands was vibrating at a frequency he could feel in his palms, in his bones, all the way to the center of him where the resonance lived and was now, permanently, irrevocably, something entirely different from what it had been 3 hours ago. Kurama, he looked up. She had moved close. Closer than she'd ever been in the mindscape. She was within arm's reach, which at her scale was not a small thing. And she was looking at him with those layered red eyes and an expression he had never seen on any face, human or otherwise, and wasn't sure he could have named if the resonance hadn't been telling him, with its new post-completion clarity, exactly what it was. It was the expression of someone recognizing, in real time, the extent of what had occurred. There it is, she said. Her voice was not steady. It was close to steady. She had 10,000 years of practice at steady. But at its edges it was something else, something real and uncontrolled in the way that real things resisted control. There it is. Yeah, he said. His own voice sounded like it was coming from a long way away. What? He stopped. Tried again. What do I feel like to you right now? She was quiet for a moment. Like everything that has been building for 20 years arriving at once, she said. Like the moment before rain when the air holds the entire potential of the storm. She paused. Like something I did not know I was waiting for. He sat back on his heels. Put his hands on his thighs. Looked at her. Really looked, with a new depth, the resonance at its completion making the act of perception something different from what it had been. He could feel her age, truly feel it. The immensity of the timeline she'd lived, not as an abstraction but as a weight that was also a richness. He could feel the loneliness of it, the long isolation, and underneath the loneliness something he had been aware of in partial glimpses for months but now saw fully. The way she had, despite everything, continued to find the world worth paying attention to. 10,000 years of a consciousness choosing, over and over, to notice things. To find the specific frequency of wind in eastern perimeter trees worth remarking on. To feel her own version of whatever she felt when he shared a sunrise with her. Kurama, he said. I know, she said. She'd been saying that more, since the night on the bridge. I know, as if the resonance made speech partially redundant, and she was acknowledging that they were both working in a medium that was no longer purely verbal. I know you know, he said. I'm saying it anyway. She looked at him. The expression was still there, the one he didn't have a name for, and something moved through the resonance that he let simply be what it was without trying to translate it. It was large enough that translation would have reduced it. "Sleep," she said eventually. "You need to sleep. What just happened? Your body needs time to integrate. Don't train tomorrow." A pause. "Eat something substantial. And Naruto." "Yeah, when you wake up," she said, with the careful precision of someone choosing exactly where to place each word, "there is something I need to tell you. Something I have been. There is something that needs to be said, and I have been trying to find the right moment, and I believe the right moment is after you've slept and eaten and your system has had time to stabilize. Because what I have to say is significant, and I would like you to receive it in a state that is not post-completion exhaustion." He looked at her. Felt through the resonance the quality of what was behind the words. Something large that had been held carefully for a long time. Something that had an old kind of weight to it that was not fear exactly but was adjacent to how fear felt when the thing being feared was not a threat, but a truth. "Is it bad?" he asked. "It is," she said slowly, "extraordinary. Whether that is good or bad remains to be determined." She looked at him steadily. "Sleep." He surfaced from the mindscape into a dark room. The candle had been out for hours. The apartment full of the particular 3 a.m. silence that was different from all other silences, the whole village held in the deepest part of its nightly rest. He sat for a moment in the dark, feeling the resonance hum at its new depth, feeling the completeness of it, the way it had settled into him like something that had always been looking for this particular shape and had finally found it. He went to bed. He dreamed, for the first time in years, of the ocean, vast and warm, lit from underneath, and not frightening. He slept until 10, which was unprecedented. He woke with the slow, full-body quality of sleep that had actually done its job. The kind of waking that happened when the body had genuinely taken what it needed and was announcing its satisfaction. He lay on his back and looked at the ceiling and felt the resonance, and let the night before move through his awareness in the gentle way of reviewing something rather than experiencing it. The fox's mastery. He'd done it. He sat up. Put his feet on the floor. Took stock of himself in the methodical way that years of high-intensity physical training had made automatic: joints, breathing, chakra levels, the baseline reading of his own system. His chakra felt different, not stronger in the sense he would have expected, not the crude increase in output that he might have anticipated, the power upgrade of legend. What had changed was more fundamental than output. His chakra moved differently. The quality of its movement through his system was, he searched for the word and landed on clean. Like water that had always contained a subtle sediment, and now didn't. The interference that had been the background condition of his own chakra generation, the noise he'd spent weeks learning to hear and then learning to quiet, was substantially reduced. His own output and Kurama's chakra and the resonance all moved in the same flow now, not 3 separate rivers sharing a channel but one river that happened to have 3 distinct headwaters. He stood. Walked to the window. Looked at Konoha in its late morning state, the market at full activity, a team of genin running a rooftop drill under the supervision of a Chunin instructor, the smoke of Ichiraku's lunch prep beginning to curl into the late autumn air. "Kurama," he thought. "You slept late," she said. "Good. You said you had something to tell me." A pause. Not the processing pause or the considering pause. The pause that had the old weight in it. "Yes. Eat first. I'll eat while you talk, Naruto, Kurama." He kept his voice, his mental voice, steady and gentle. "Whatever it is, it's okay. You know I know that, because you can feel it. And I know it's significant because I can feel that too. Just tell me." Another pause. Longer. He started water for tea, moved around his kitchen with the automatic ease of the routine. "When the fox's mastery completes," she said slowly, "the resonance produces what the Uzumaki texts call a generative consequence. The passage you read." "The unnamed author, a living thing," he said. "Yes." A breath. He heard her breathe in the resonance, which was something he was still getting used to. The mechanism by which this happens is not biological. I want to be clear about that. Not in any human sense. The Bijou do not. We don't. This isn't something that has a physical component in the way you're likely imagining. A pause. "But it is real. It is as real as I am, which is to say it is a form of life that exists in the way that all things exist, as a specific and persistent pattern of chakra and consciousness. He set down his teacup. "What are you telling me?" he said out loud, because this felt like a conversation that should be spoken rather than only thought. "I am telling you," she said, with a careful steadiness that he could feel her working to maintain, "that there is a new presence in the resonance. It has been there for approximately 3 weeks. I became certain of it 2 weeks ago. It is not me. It is not you. It is," she stopped. "It carries both of our frequencies. Mine and yours. As its fundamental nature." A pause. "It is small. It is new. It is the most extraordinary thing I have experienced in 10,000 years. And I have been trying to find words for it for 2 weeks, and I don't have them yet." Naruto stood very still in his kitchen. The tea kettle began to make its pre-boiling sound. "A presence," he said. "Yes. In the resonance. Yes. Carrying both our." "Yes," she said. "Naruto. Yeah. Are you all right?" He put both hands on the kitchen counter. Looked at them, his hands, ordinary hands, the hands that could at current capacity produce a raisin large enough to move a mountain, and felt the information moving through him in the way that information too large for immediate processing moved, like a wave that you had to let pass over rather than trying to stand against. "Can I?" he started. Stopped. Tried again. "Can I feel it? If I look for it in the resonance, can I?" "Yes," she said quietly. "But gently. It is very new." He closed his eyes. The resonance at its post-completion depth was spacious in a way it hadn't been before. Not larger exactly, but clearer, the way a room felt larger when it was clean. He moved his awareness through it the way he'd learned in weeks of training, not grasping, not pushing, following rather than seeking. And there it was. He would not have known to call it small if Kurama hadn't said small. To him it felt. It was not large, certainly, not in the way either he or Kurama was large in the resonance. But it was intensely present. A point of light, almost, though light was not quite right. A point of something. A specific and distinct and undeniable presence with a frequency that was. He could hear both of them in it. His own rhythm and hers, woven together in a proportion that was new, that was either of them, that was. He opened his eyes. He sat down on the kitchen floor. Not intentionally. His legs made a decision. "Oh," he said. It was not an eloquent response to the most significant moment of his life. It was what came out. "Yes," Kurama said. Her voice carried something that the resonance translated for him without words. Something immense and old and utterly new at the same time. Something she was feeling for the first time in 10,000 years of feeling things. And that she was, despite all her practice at composure, not successfully containing. He sat on the kitchen floor of his apartment, while the tea kettle reached its boil and began to whistle, and he felt, in the place inside him where the resonance lived and where the new small undeniable presence had made its home, the specific and wordless quality of something that had been moving toward this point for 20 years, perhaps for longer, perhaps for the entire history of the world, arriving. "It's okay," he said, to the kitchen and to the resonance, and to Kurama and to the small presence that probably didn't yet have the faculties to hear him, but that he was speaking to anyway because it felt necessary. "It's okay. I've got you. Both of us," Kurama said, and her voice was not level anymore. "Not even close. You've got both of us." He put his face in his hands and stayed like that for a while. The tea kettle whistled. He called an emergency meeting with himself. This was a technique he developed in adolescence when a situation became complicated enough that talking it through with someone else felt premature, but leaving it entirely unexamined felt catastrophic. He made tea. He sat at his kitchen table. He allocated himself 20 minutes to simply exist in the reality of the information before deciding on any action. The information, he and Kurama, through the completion of the fox's mastery, had produced something. Not in any biological or physical sense. He was clear on that, had heard her clearly on that point. Something that existed in the resonance. A presence with both their chakra frequencies as its fundamental nature. Small. New. Real. The Uzumaki texts had described this possibility. A living thing. It takes different forms depending on the natures involved. The unnamed author had written about it with the urgency of someone documenting the barely believable. The passage had been there. He had read it. He had discussed it with Kurama in the careful circling way that they'd been discussing it for weeks. He had, on some level, known this was possible. Knowing something is possible and being in the room with its reality were, as he had been continuously rediscovering in the last 6 months, different things. Are you panicking? Kurama asked, from the resonance. She'd asked with a careful neutrality that he recognized as her version of concern. I'm having a very controlled reaction, he said. That's almost the same thing. I'm fine. I can feel your heart rate. I'm fine, he said again, with slightly more conviction. He took a long drink of tea. Set the cup down. Looked at the table. I'm going to need to tell people. Eventually, she said. Not immediately. Kakashi is already going to have a report on his desk about an anomalous chakra signature from last night. The ANBU monitoring system, I'm aware. A pause. The completion of the Fox's mastery produces a signature that no monitoring system will have prior classification for. It will register as unusual but not hostile. Kakashi will investigate. Another pause. He should be told first. Agreed. He considered. And Sasuke already knows something significant happened. He said he'd be nearby. He's going to have felt last night. Yes. The quality of her acknowledgement carried something that he'd learned to identify as her version of reluctant concession. She and Sasuke had a relationship in the resonance that was approximately equivalent to two very different instruments in the same orchestra acknowledging each other's presence and relative capability while maintaining the professional conviction that the other section was slightly less essential. And Sakura wanted to do a chakra diagnostic this week. She's going to notice everything. Sakura would notice a 1-degree change in barometric pressure if it had medical implications. A pause. She should be told. She has the most relevant expertise for what comes next. He looked at the resonance. The small presence was still there, steady and quiet, doing whatever new existences did in their early stages. He found himself orienting toward it with a protectiveness that was immediate and unanalyzed. He noted it. Did not try to analyze it. What does it need? He asked. Right now, in this stage. What does it need? The resonance, she said. The connection between us, at this depth. It exists in the resonance the way a plant exists in soil. The depth of the connection is what sustains it. A pause, which means you need to sustain the depth. Which means, continuing the mindscape work, even now that the completion is reached. Not as training anymore. As maintenance. As presence. I can do that. I know, she said. I'm not worried about that. What are you worried about? A long pause. The kind that had genuine weight, that he'd learned not to rush. The world, she said. Ultimately. What happens when the world understands what this is? There is no precedent, not living precedent, not anything outside of your clan's most obscure theoretical records. The village will have questions. Some of them will not come from curiosity. Her tone had shifted into the register he associated with strategic thinking. The old intelligence, the 10,000 years of watching human patterns, applied to the immediate situation. There will be those who see the completion of the Fox's mastery and perceive a weapon, who will want to understand it in those terms, who will attempt to access it, replicate it, weaponize the resonance itself. He had been thinking this too, in the part of his mind that was always, underneath everything, still a shinobi. I'll handle it, he said. We'll handle it, she said, with a precision that made clear the correction was not semantic. He felt the warmth of it move through the resonance. Settled his hands on the table. Looked at his kitchen, ordinary morning light, the sounds of the village going about its life outside, and let the enormity of what had happened and what it meant and what came next exist, alongside the ordinary, the way the most significant things always ended up existing alongside the ordinary, refusing to displace it entirely. Okay, he said. One thing at a time. First, I'm going to eat a proper breakfast. Then I'm going to go see Kakashi. That is a reasonable sequence of events, she said. And Kurama. Yes. He touched the resonance. Found the small presence. Held his awareness there for a moment, the way you held a hand. Thank you, he said. For telling me. For all of it. For the whole thing, from the beginning. For deciding I was interesting and then significant, and then the thing you don't have a word for. The resonance moved. What came back from her was not words. It was something older than words, something that had been waiting for longer than language existed to travel down a channel exactly like this one, to exactly the person it was meant to reach. He let it arrive. Let it be in him fully. Then he got up and made breakfast. Eggs and rice and the greens he'd bought from the market with Hinata, which had been sitting in the refrigerator waiting for him to stop forgetting. And he ate at his kitchen table with the morning light on his face, and the resonance humming its new deep note, and the small, extraordinary presence going about its small extraordinary business in the place where it lived, and he felt, underneath the enormity of it all, something that he recognized from only a few previous moments in his life. Ready. Not ready in the sense of having everything figured out. Ready in the sense of facing what was in front of him with everything he had, which had always been enough before, not because he was exceptional in the calculated way but because he was the specific kind of stubborn that turned out, in enough situations, to matter more than exceptional. He washed his dishes. Put on his jacket. Checked the resonance one more time, small presence, steady, doing fine, and opened the door to the ordinary morning. All right, he said, to himself and to Kurama and to the new presence, and to whatever came next. Let's go. Kakashi was in his office when Naruto arrived, which meant Kakashi was probably pretending to read administrative documents while actually reading something else. A hypothesis confirmed when Naruto knocked and entered and observed the Hokage making a movement that could charitably be described as an attempt to slip a small book under a pile of mission reports. Naruto, Kakashi said, with the visible equanimity of someone who had decided, long ago, that his dignity was a renewable resource. I was just reading Ika while ignoring the ANBU overnight report on my apartment's chakra signature, Naruto said, taking the chair across the desk without being invited, because he never waited to be invited. Kakashi looked at him for a moment. Then he reached under the mission reports and put the small book in his desk drawer without comment. He leaned back in his chair, his visible eye moving over Naruto with the particular attention that it usually reserved for things that required significant reassessment. Tell me what happened last night. The Fox's Mastery. A pause. I'm familiar with the term. From the Uzumaki archives? From the archives, and from Jiraiya's research notes, and from a conversation I had with Minato-sensei once, about your mother, about the theoretical limits of the Jinchuriki Bijou bond. Kakashi's visible eye had not moved from him. He believed it was mythological. An aspirational concept rather than an achievable state. He was working with different conditions, Naruto said. He and Mom built the seal for containment. The starting position was different, and your starting position, mutual choice, from both sides over about 20 years. He met Kakashi's eye steadily. It's real, sensei. It completed last night. My chakra system is different. Sakura can confirm it when she does the diagnostic she's been asking for. The signature the ANBU flagged is the resonance at full depth. It's not a threat to the village. I know it's not a threat to the village, Kakashi said mildly. I've known you since you were a small disaster in Orange, and I've developed some confidence in my threat assessment where you're specifically concerned. He tilted his head. But Naruto agreed. Something is different about you beyond the chakra signature. Something that the Sharingan would read and I suspect the Byakugan would read and that Sakura's medical chakra is going to read. Something that isn't just the completion of the technique itself. Naruto looked at him. Kakashi had always been perceptive in the specific way that people who observed more than they spoke developed. A reading of the space between things as well as the things themselves. There's something else, Naruto said. That comes with the completion. The texts describe it as a generative consequence. Something that's produced by the full resonance that is, it's not a threat, it's not a weapon, it's not something that's going to destabilize anything. But it's real and it's new and it doesn't fit existing categories and I'm still understanding it myself. Kakashi looked at him for a long time. The office was very quiet. Outside, the morning sounds of the village drifted through the window, familiar and grounding and completely indifferent to the unprecedented things happening inside this room. You're going to need to explain this in more detail, Kakashi said. Fully. I need to understand what we're working with. I know. Naruto leaned forward, elbows on his knees. But I need to understand some of it better myself first. Give me a week. I'll come back with everything I have. The Uzumaki research, the full account of what the resonance has become, what the generative consequence actually is, and what it means practically. 1 week. Another long look. Then Kakashi exhaled, the slow, deliberate exhale of someone deciding to extend trust based on accumulated evidence rather than current information, which was its own kind of courage. 1 week, he said. And Naruto. Yeah? Get Sakura involved now. Not in a week. Now. His eye was serious in the way it rarely was. Whatever is happening, you need someone with medical expertise tracking it. Don't wait on that. Already planned, Naruto said. He stood. Kakashi watched him from behind the desk, and Naruto saw on his sensei's face, briefly and clearly, the thing that was always there under the administration and the equanimity and the perpetual paperwork. The man who had stood on a battlefield 20 years ago, and done the thing that had to be done, and had lived with it, and who now had the person that thing had made sitting across from him looking more himself, and more changed than he'd ever been simultaneously. Your father would have found this extraordinary, Kakashi said quietly. Naruto held that for a moment. Let it be in him the way he let all the things about his father be in him now, not painfully, not with the old ache of absence, but with the more complicated feeling of someone who had made peace with the story without being able to change it. Yeah, he said. He would have. He left the office and walked out into the morning, the resonance warm and steady in the depth of him, the small new presence going about its quiet and extraordinary existence, and the world waiting ahead in all its ordinary and impossible complexity, one thing at a time. First Kakashi. Then Sakura. Then, eventually, everything else. Sakura's medical office smelled like antiseptic and green tea and the particular quality of organized calm that she imposed on every space she inhabited long enough. It was a small office. She'd refused the larger one the hospital administration had offered her twice, on the grounds that a large office encouraged accumulation, and she didn't want to accumulate anything that slowed her down. What she had instead was a desk, 2 chairs, a diagnostic table, bookshelves organized with a precision that suggested genuine consequences for disruption, and a window that looked out onto the hospital's interior garden where someone had planted winter jasmine that was, improbably, still blooming in the late autumn cold. She had him on the diagnostic table within 3 minutes of his arrival. This was Sakura's way. He'd known it long enough to simply accept it, to sit on the table and extend his arms when asked and breathe when instructed and hold still when told, with the trust that came from knowing that the hands currently reading his chakra system were the best in their field and that the field was, at present, exactly what was needed. Her medical chakra moved through him in the way it had since she'd developed it, precise and thorough and fast, a systematic sweep from his crown to his feet that missed nothing. She stopped, backed up, swept the same region again. Naruto, she said. Yeah. How long has there been a third chakra signature in your system? He prepared for this question. Had decided, on the walk to the hospital, to be fully honest with Sakura because of all the people in his life she was both the most medically essential and the least likely to react in ways that prioritized her own emotional processing over his current needs. She would have feelings. She would have extensive feelings. But she would have them in an order that put the medical and practical picture first. The third signature started becoming detectable about 3 weeks ago, he said. By me. By the resonance. You might have caught it earlier than that with the diagnostic. I don't know. I would have caught it, she said, with the assurance of someone who had run enough baseline diagnostics on him over the years to have a near-encyclopedic understanding of his chakra system's normal parameters. I'm catching it now and it's here. It's not peripheral. It's central. It's in the resonance itself. She moved her hands in the diagnostic gesture, and her expression was doing the thing it did when she was processing something genuinely new, a quality of focused stillness that was different from her normal focused expression because it had a fraction of hesitation at its edges, a recalibration happening in real time. It carries your frequency, yes, and Kurama's frequency, yes, in equal proportion. I'm not sure it's exactly equal. Kurama describes it as a new proportion. Something that belongs to either of us as a subset. Sakura withdrew her hands. Stood back. Looked at him with green eyes that were doing something he could only describe as methodical acceptance. the intake of new information and the deliberate construction of a framework around it, refusing to let the strangeness of the information be a reason to stop processing it accurately. She was quiet for, he counted, because he was curious, 47 seconds. Tell me everything, she said. From the beginning. All of it. He told her everything. It took 40 minutes. She did not interrupt, which was characteristic of her when the information was both critical and complex. She developed a particular way of listening that was almost physically intense, the whole of her attention converging on the speaker the way a lens converged light. He covered the Uzumaki archives, the Kyushin no Fumi, the progression of the resonance across 6 months of training, the night on the bridge, the completion of the fox's mastery. He described, as precisely as he could, what the third presence felt like from inside the resonance, its position, its quality, the frequency it carried. When he finished, she was still for a moment. Then she turned to her desk, sat, and pulled out a notebook. Started writing, fast and precise. He waited. The Uzumaki texts, she said, without looking up. Do you have copies or do I need to request access from the archives? I have copies of the relevant passages. I'll bring them this afternoon. Good. She kept writing. The third signature. You described it as existing in the resonance rather than in your physical chakra system. That's consistent with what I'm reading. It's present in your baseline, because the resonance itself is now integrated into your baseline, but it doesn't have its own independent pathway through your coils. It's not biological. Kurama was clear about that. Right. Sakura looked up. Her expression had finished its recalibration and was now in the mode he associated with her at her most formidable, clear-eyed, focused, already 3 steps into the practical implications. So we're not talking about a physical pregnancy in any sense that human medicine has a framework for. We're talking about a new form of life that exists in the chakra dimension, in the spiritual framework, that is sustained by the resonance between you and Kurama. Yes. Kurama described it as, she said, the resonance is the soil. The presence exists in it the way a plant exists in soil, which means the stability of the presence is directly tied to the depth and stability of the resonance, which is why the fox's mastery completion being maintained matters, he said. If the resonance degraded, the presence would be at risk. She was writing again. Okay. I need to run more comprehensive diagnostics over the next week, daily if you can manage it. I need to track the stability of the resonance post-completion, document how it changes as you continue the mindscape work, and try to get a clearer picture of the third signature's characteristics. She paused. I'm going to be honest with you, Naruto. I am operating significantly outside my training and existing medical literature here. I know, which means I'm going to make mistakes. I might read things wrong or prioritize the wrong variables or miss things that the Uzumaki texts would have told me if I'd had the context. She met his eyes directly. I need you to tell me everything Kurama tells you. Everything. Don't filter for what you think is medically relevant. Tell me all of it. Agreed. And I need access to Kurama directly if that's possible. Can she communicate with me through you? Can I ask her questions and have her answer them? He considered. They'd done this before, occasionally, in medical contexts, Sakura asking about the Bijou chakra's effect on his healing rate, Kurama providing precise answers through the channel of the resonance while Naruto relayed them. It was slightly awkward in the way that 3-way conversations conducted through a single body were inherently slightly awkward, but it worked. Kurama, he thought. I heard, she said. Yes. I'll speak with her. I have observations about the third signature that will be more useful coming from me directly. She says yes, Naruto said. She has things to tell you that she wants to communicate directly. Sakura nodded, pulling a second notebook from her drawer. All right. She looked at him with an expression that had finally let something through its professional surface, something personal, something that was less medic assessing patient and more friend seeing friend. Naruto, I know, he said preemptively. You have no idea what I'm about to say. You're about to say something about how I should have come to you earlier, or how you're glad I came now, or how this is a lot to take in. She looked at him. I was going to say that you look more yourself than you have in years. A pause. Whatever this is, whatever's happening, you look like someone who's found something they didn't know they were missing. She held his gaze. I'm glad. He was quiet for a moment. Felt the resonance hum its warm note, felt Kurama's awareness of the exchange, felt, quietly and without announcement, the small presence doing its steady, extraordinary business in the place where it lived. Yeah, he said. Me too. Sakura's first direct conversation with Kurama lasted 2 hours and resulted in 4 full pages of notes, 2 new diagnostic protocols, and a mutual assessment between physician and bijou that Naruto would have described as professional respect with edges of something warmer that neither party was particularly inclined to acknowledge. Kurama was precise. She had been observing the presence for 3 weeks with the comprehensive attention of something that had no competing priorities for its perceptual resources, and what she reported to Sakura was detailed enough to make the medic's pen move almost continuously. The presence's chakra frequency, its stability metrics across the past 3 weeks, the way it had responded to the fox's mastery completion, not growing stronger but growing more defined, more distinct, more like a specific and particular thing rather than a generalized field. It's coalescing, Sakura said, halfway through the second hour. She'd stopped writing and was sitting back with the expression of someone holding a large and structurally complex idea at arm's length in order to examine it. It's gaining specificity. The frequency is becoming more individual. Yes, Kurama said through the resonance, with Naruto relaying in real time. The Uzumaki text used the word, Naruto, the word on the 14th page of the secondary text, the one in the oldest script. He found it in his memory, the specific archaic character. The word is close to individuation, he said. The process by which a general potential becomes a specific being. Individuation, Sakura repeated. She wrote it down. How long does this process take? The texts, do they specify a duration? They don't, Kurama said. Because this has not happened in recorded history in the way it is happening now. There is one precedent, partial and imperfect. I know of it not from the Uzumaki records but from my own memory. Sakura looked up. From your own memory, she said carefully. You witnessed it. Not witnessed, Kurama said. I was not present. But I am old enough to have known beings who were. The story that exists in bijou memory, not human record bijou memory, which is different, and does not commit everything to text, is of a Jinchuriki from before the founding of the hidden villages, before the sage's sons. Very early. In the period when the bijou were newly individuated from the 10 tails and the nature of the sealing was not yet understood. Naruto had not heard this. He felt his own attention sharpen alongside Sakura's. That Jinchuriki, Kurama continued, and the bijou they carried, I don't know which bijou, the memory is not that precise, reached something equivalent to what Naruto and I have reached. The texts your clan preserved describe the theoretical possibility. The bijou memory preserves the story of the one time it actually occurred. A pause. What was produced between them was not what human medical frameworks would recognize as a child. Not what bijou frameworks would recognize as a bijou. It was something that existed in the space between, in the resonance dimension, which the ancient practitioners called by a different name. The spirit layer, the place where chakra and consciousness intersect before they become either physical matter or pure energy. What happened to it? Sakura asked. Her voice was very level, the way it got when she was managing her own response carefully in order to maintain the clinical clarity the situation required. The being that was produced. It grew, Kurama said. It developed. Not quickly. Time in the resonance dimension is not linear in the way physical time is linear, but it grew into something that had awareness, and intention, and the capacity to act in the world, though not through a physical body. It could move through the spirit layer. It could perceive the physical world. It could, at moments of great need or great invitation, affect the physical world in specific and limited ways. Another pause. In the old languages, they called these beings Kitsune no Rei. Fox spirits. Messenger spirits. The stories that appear in every culture's mythology about creatures that exist between the worlds. Beings that are not human, not animal, not God, but something of all three. Most of those stories, across every land and every tradition, have this as their origin. The medical office was very quiet. Naruto sat on the diagnostic table and felt the enormity of what she just said move through him in slow and massive waves, the way the sea moved against coastline, not violent but inexorable, reshaping the land simply by the fact of continuous arrival. The Kitsun spirits of legend, he said slowly. The fox messengers. The spirit guardians. Yes, Kurama said. Every story you have heard, every tale of a fox spirit that appeared to a traveler in need, or guarded a shrine, or carried a message between the mortal world and some other place, every one of those stories, at its root, is about something like what is growing in the resonance between Naruto and me. Sakura had not moved. She was looking at Naruto with an expression that had gone very still in the way that expressions went still when the mind behind them was engaged in something too large for the face to simultaneously process. The origin of the Kitsun myths, she said. We're talking about the literal origin, the origin that gave the myths their truth, Kurama said. There are always embellishments. Human memory and human storytelling are additive arts, but the core, the being that existed between worlds, that carried something of the human and something of the bijou, that could not be fully claimed by either realm, that is real. That has existed before, and it is, in the resonance dimension, taking shape again. Naruto looked down at his hands. He had been doing that a lot lately, looking at his hands as if they were new, as if the fact that they were the same hands that had always been attached to him was somehow remarkable given everything that had changed. Is it aware? He asked. Right now. Does it know anything? Does it feel anything? In the way that the very earliest stages of awareness feel, Kurama said. Her voice had shifted into something quieter, something more personal. Not thought. Not emotion in the complex sense, but something that is the beginning of both. Warmth. The resonance itself. A sense of presence, of its own existence, in the way that the first syllable of consciousness always precedes the language that the consciousness eventually develops. A pause. It knows the resonance. It knows us. That is, at this stage enough. He closed his eyes. Found the presence in the resonance. Held his awareness there. It was still there. Still steady. Still doing its quiet and extraordinary thing. Okay, he said. The week passed in the rhythm that significant things established. Not the frantic pace of crisis, but the deliberate pace of genuine reckoning. Each day organized around the tasks that the situation required and the space between tasks occupied by the slow, continuous work of integrating what had happened into the fabric of a life that had to continue being lived. He went to Sakura every morning for the diagnostic. She had developed a protocol within 24 hours, precise, methodical, tracking 12 variables simultaneously. And she documented everything with the focused intensity of a researcher who understood that she was building a record that did not yet exist and that might, at some future point, matter enormously to people who were not yet born. He went to the mindscape every night. The sessions had changed in character since the completion, less training, more of what Kurama had called maintenance, and which felt, in practice, like something closer to communion. He sat in the clearing with the amber light and the great red gold tree. And Kurama was there, and they talked or didn't talk and the resonance ran at its full depth between them, and the small presence was there too, and the act of being present to it had become the most important part of his day, the fixed point around which everything else arranged itself. He was sitting in the clearing 4 nights into that week when Kurama said something that shifted the picture again. There is something I haven't told you, she said. She was at the base of the tree, and he was a few feet away. And the atmosphere between them had the quality that it sometimes had now, not tense, something more like the weight of a thing that was about to be said. He looked at her. Another something. The precedent story, she said. The Jinchuriki from before the villages. What happened with the being that was produced between them? She paused. I told Sakura the beginning. I didn't tell you the end. Tell me the end. She looked at the canopy above them for a long moment. The being grew, she said. As I described. It developed awareness, and then intention, and then the capacity to act in the world. It existed in the spirit layer for a long time. The bijou memory doesn't give precise dates. Long. Another pause. It was, by all accounts in the memory, remarkable. Unlike anything before or since, it could move between the physical world and the spirit layer with a freedom that neither humans nor bijou possessed. It could perceive both simultaneously. It carried the warmth of human connection and the power of bijou essence, and the specific wisdom that comes from belonging fully to either world while being capable of traveling through both. He waited. He could feel the shape of the pause, the thing that hadn't been said yet. And the Jinchuriki? He asked. Kurama was quiet. What happened to them? They were not harmed by it, she said carefully. The production of the being didn't damage them. Medically, physically, in terms of their chakra system, they were fine. Better than fine, in some ways. The resonance at that depth appears to have a stabilizing effect on the physical system, not a depleting one. She paused again. But they were changed. In the way that the most significant things change you. They could not go back to the relationship they'd had with the world before it. The awareness that came with the fox's mastery, the depth of the resonance, the existence of the spirit being, it altered the parameters of their life in ways that were not reversible. I didn't expect reversible, he said. I know. Her tails shifted. But I want you to understand what that means practically. Your life is going to be different, not just because of the power the completion grants, not just because the village will eventually know and have questions. Different in yourself. The way you perceive things, the way you move through the world. She looked at him directly. You will never be able to fully explain what you are to someone who has not experienced something equivalent. You will be, in a specific and unalterable way, something that has not existed before. He sat with that. Felt it move through him in its full weight without trying to reduce it. Were they okay? He asked. Ultimately. The Jinchuriki in the story. Kurama's expression did the thing he still didn't have a clean name for. The old thing, the thing that lived in the space between the controlled face she maintained and the vast ancient awareness behind it. The thing that was perhaps closest to what she'd called the force of not having words for something. Yes, she said. They were, by all accounts, genuinely okay. More than okay. The memory describes them as, she paused, choosing. As someone who had found the complete version of themselves, not a perfect life. Not an easy one. But a complete one. She paused again. I find that I want that for you. He looked at her. Felt the resonance carry the weight of what she'd said, and under it, not under it but threaded through it, inseparable from it, the things she hadn't said in words but that the resonance made perfectly legible. I find that I want it for both of us, he said. She was quiet. He felt through the resonance the response to that, the immense, old, carefully held thing, finding its edges again in this moment, the way it had been finding its edges progressively for months, each time landing a little less carefully, a little more openly, as if the thing that had been contained for 10,000 years was discovering, gradually, and with appropriate caution, what it felt like to have somewhere to go. The story doesn't have a record of what the bijou wanted, she said. Her voice was careful in the specific way that careful became when it was managing something real. The bijou memory preserves what the being became, and what the Jinchuriki experienced, but the bijou's own perspective is not recorded. Or if it was, that record is not in the part of the memory I have access to. A pause. I find that I notice this absence. Yeah, he said. So do I. I want to be clear, she said, with the precision that she invoked when she was being especially deliberate. She stopped. Tried again. The way that I experience what has happened between us is not something I have a complete vocabulary for. It is not something I had a framework for before it began, because nothing in 10,000 years of existing had produced a framework. I have been building the vocabulary in real time, the way you build a path through a forest that has no prior paths, slowly, through repetition, by learning which ground holds weight. He waited. The presence, she said? The being that is developing in the resonance. Another pause, longer than most. I find that I feel toward it something that is, it is the most straightforwardly comprehensible thing I have felt in a very long time. There is no ambiguity in it. No qualification. No accumulated history of injury making it complicated. Her voice had dropped to something that was almost quiet in the way the mindscape itself was quiet, a quality of fundamental stillness. It is simply, love. The word exists in your language and I find that it is the right word, without caveat or amendment, for the first time in 10,000 years of knowing that the word existed. Naruto didn't say anything. He didn't think anything was required. He sat in the clearing in the amber light, and felt the resonance carry what she'd said between them, and felt the small presence in its corner of the resonance doing its steady and extraordinary living, and he let all of it be exactly what it was without trying to frame it or categorize it or manage it. After a while he said, I know, I know you know, she said. I'm saying it anyway. He heard his own words from 3 days ago return to him, and he felt, underneath the enormity of everything, underneath the unprecedented nature of the situation, underneath the awareness of what still had to be faced and navigated and explained and protected, something that was, in its simplest form, happiness. The uncomplicated kind. The kind that arrived when the right thing happened, and you knew it was right, and you let it be. Okay, he said. What happens next? The being continues to develop, she said. It will take time. I don't know how much. The precedent is imprecise about duration. What I know is that the development requires the resonance to remain stable and deep, which requires you to maintain the mindscape practice, and it requires the physical world to not destabilize things enough to force the resonance into a defensive configuration. What does that mean practically? It means, she said, that if the village, or other shinobi nations, or any actor with sufficient power and sufficient motivation decides to treat the completion of the fox's mastery as a threat to be neutralized or a resource to be weaponized, if the resonance comes under sufficient external pressure, the being's development could be disrupted. Her voice was precise and controlled, and underneath the precision was something with teeth in it. I will not allow that. Neither will I, he said. The resonance carried both their intentions simultaneously, and the overlap between them was not a collision, but a harmony. Two very different kinds of determination, his and hers, different in origin and different in shape, finding the same direction. Then we need to be strategic, she said. About who knows, when they know, and how it's framed. I've been thinking about that, he said. Kakashi knows the existence of the completion. He doesn't know the full picture yet. Sakura knows the medical dimension. Hinata knows something significant is happening. Sasuke knows enough to be watching. He paused. I think the people closest to me need to know everything. Not because I want to perform transparency for its own sake, but because the situation is going to become visible eventually, and the people I trust should hear it from me with full context, not encounter it through fragments and rumors. I agree, she said. With the caveat that how you explain the nature of the presence, of the being, needs to be done carefully. There is no existing framework for what it is. Giving people inadequate framing will produce misunderstanding, and misunderstanding produces fear, and fear in people with significant power and access produces exactly the destabilization we need to avoid. So we need a way to explain it that's accurate, and that doesn't require people to have already understood everything that led here. Yes. She paused. I have been trying to construct that explanation. It is more difficult than most explanations I have attempted. What have you got so far? She looked at him with those layered ancient eyes, and something crossed her face that was unexpected. He'd learned a large vocabulary of her expressions by now, could read most of them with confidence, but this was one he'd never seen before. It took him a moment to identify it. It was sheepishness. On Kurama. 10,000-year-old bijou of immense power. Sheepishness. I have been composing and discarding explanations for 2 weeks, she said, with the dignity of someone absolutely not admitting this was a challenge, and the most accurate version remains deeply counterintuitive for anyone without the full context. Let me try, he said. She looked at him. The bond between a Jinchuriki and their bijou, he started slowly, working it out as he went, has always been described as containment. That's the framework everyone uses. The bijou is sealed, the Jinchuriki contains it, the seal is the mechanism. But what the Uzumaki texts actually describe, what we've actually experienced, is that it was never really containment. It was always a relationship, and like any relationship that becomes deep enough and honest enough, it produced something. Not deliberately. Not as a planned outcome, as the natural consequence of two forms of life genuinely knowing each other. He paused. The thing it produced is new. It has never existed in quite this form before. Or it existed once, so long ago that it's become legend. It's not dangerous. It's not a weapon. He stopped. Started again. It's what happens when something truly unprecedented becomes possible, and then actually happens. He looked at her. How's that? She considered for a long moment. Better than what I had, she said. Though it still requires significant follow-up explanation. Most true things do, he said. She looked at him with the expression that lived between exasperation and something considerably warmer. Go to sleep, she said. Tomorrow you should go see Hinata. She is going to notice on her own within a week regardless, and she deserves to hear it from you first. I was planning that, he said. He stood, stretching. Kurama. Yes. We're going to be okay. The amber light pulsed once, slow and warm. I know, she said. I've been okay before in worse circumstances. But yes. She turned her face away, toward the canopy of the tree, and her voice came from that slight angling, more private, more internal. The way things said to the side were sometimes more honest than things said directly. This is better than okay. By a significant margin. He surfaced from the mindscape into the dark apartment. Sat in the dark, felt the resonance, felt the presence, felt the vast and ancient awareness at the other end of the connection doing its own version of sitting in the dark, on the other side of the bridge they'd built. He had no precedent for this. The Uzumaki texts were incomplete. The Bijou memory was imprecise. The one other time this had happened was so long ago it had become the mythology of every culture that had ever existed, the origin of every story about creatures that walked between worlds. He was going to have to figure it out as he went, which was, come to think of it, exactly how he'd figured out everything that had ever actually mattered. He lay down on his bed. Looked at the ceiling. Kurama, he thought. Still here, she said from the resonance. Still here, he agreed. He closed his eyes. In the space inside him where the resonance lived, the small presence went about its quiet and extraordinary business, growing, slowly, at its own rate, in its own time, toward whatever it was going to become. Outside, the moon had risen. Konoha was silver and quiet under it, ordinary and oblivious, full of people living their lives and having no idea that something was happening in a shinobi's apartment that the mythology of their entire civilization had been reaching toward. In story after story told by firelight across 10,000 years, for as long as there had been people to tell stories to each other in the dark. 3 days later, he went to see Hinata. She was in the garden behind their building, the small garden she maintained with the patient, precise attention she brought to everything, even in late autumn when most things were either dormant or past their best. She was crouching near the winter jasmine, examining something on one of the branches with a focus that dissolved when she heard his footsteps and looked up. She saw his face and stood. Come inside, she said. Not a question. He told her over tea in her kitchen. All of it. She listened the way she always listened, completely, without deflection, her pale eyes steady and present through all of it, including the parts that he watched carefully for the reaction they produced, the parts about the presence, and what Kurama had told him of the precedent, and what Sakura's diagnostics were tracking. She did not interrupt. She did not look alarmed. She held the full account the way she held most large things, with a quiet strength that he'd known since childhood and had never entirely stopped being moved by. When he finished, she was quiet for a while. Then she said, "Can I feel it?" He looked at her. Feel it? The resonance. The presence. She met his eyes. Kurama lets you share things through the connection. You showed it to me, the sunrise, I mean. You didn't mean to, I think, but I was close enough and the resonance was open enough that she paused. I felt it once. The edge of it. I didn't tell you because I wasn't sure what I'd felt. He thought about it. Brought it to the resonance deliberately, the question of Hinata feeling the presence's edge. If she can, Kurama said, with careful consideration, and if she is who she is and won't misread it, yes. But very gently. The presence responds to attention. Warm attention. Nothing scrutinizing. Kurama says yes, he said. Just hold your attention warmly. Don't examine, just be near it. Hinata reached across the table and put her hands over his. Closed her eyes. Her Byakugan didn't activate. She was being careful, using ordinary perception rather than the Kekkei Genkai, because ordinary perception was warm in a way that the Byakugan's total perception sometimes wasn't. He opened the resonance gently. Let the warmth of it be present at the surface where she could feel the edge of it. She went very still. After a moment, something happened to her face that he didn't have a word for. Something that settled and opened simultaneously, like a door closing on a cold night, and a window opening onto a warm morning at the same time. Something that was very simply and very completely real. She opened her eyes. Looked at him. Oh, she said softly. The word carried everything. Yeah, he said. She looked at him for a long time, with the expression she reserved for things she found genuinely beautiful. Then she squeezed his hands once and let go and picked up her tea, and they sat in the warm kitchen in the late autumn afternoon and didn't say much for a while, which was one of the things he'd always valued about her, the capacity to sit in the important things without requiring them to be immediately translated into words. She understands, Kurama said quietly, from the resonance. Yeah, he said. She usually does. Outside the window, the sky had gone the particular shade of late afternoon gold that would, in 20 minutes, become the specific arrangement of rose and amber that he'd been sharing with Kurama every evening for weeks. He found himself orienting toward it already, the anticipation of it. The small daily offering, the way something so ordinary had become, through nothing more than the act of choosing to pay attention to it together, something neither ordinary nor extraordinary but simply necessary. He thought about the unnamed Uzumaki author and the words written in older ink at the bottom of that last page. Things that matter that much change the shape of your life in ways you cannot predict. He was inside that now. The changed shape. Living the version of his life that the resonance had carved, making its new channels, settling into the landscape it had altered. He looked at Hinata. He thought about Kakashi waiting for the full explanation. About Sasuke watching from the edges. About Sakura's notebooks filling with the first medical record of something that had no prior medical record. About the small presence going about its business in the resonance, becoming more defined every day, becoming more specifically itself, becoming the thing that every fox spirit story since the beginning of human storytelling had been, in its deepest root, attempting to describe. He thought about what came next. Not with dread. With the specific quality of readiness that had always, in his experience, preceded the things that mattered most, not confidence that it would be easy, but the willingness to face it fully regardless, one thing at a time. First the people he trusted. Then the world.